This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. It all started when I got busted for a DUI a few months back. The judge gave me a choice, jail time or community service. Being the idiot I was, I figured working at my Uncle Ned's auto salvage yard in bumfuck Nebraska would be the easy way out. Boy, was I wrong. Uncle Ned's place was this massive lot filled with rusted-out junkers as far as the eye could see. During the day it wasn't so bad. Just tedious work sorting scrap metal and stripping cars for parts. But at night, that's when things got weird. I was on the graveyard shift, all alone except for the distant barking of my uncle's mean old junkyard dog. The floodlights cast eerie shadows across the piles of twisted metal. I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't shake this creeping feeling of being watched. That's when I first noticed the green Chevy. It was this old beater from the 70s, all dented up with the windshield shattered. But there was something off about it. I could have sworn I saw movement inside, like a shadow passing behind the cracked glass. I told myself I was just jumpy from too much coffee, but then I heard it, a faint whisper coming from the car. "Help me," it said. I nearly pissed myself right there. Against my better judgment, I crept closer to investigate. The door creaked open on its own, and before I knew what was happening, I was yanked inside by some unseen force. Suddenly, I wasn't in the junkyard anymore. I was on a dark country road, gripping the wheel of the Chevy as it barreled down the highway. My heart was racing, adrenaline pumping. I could smell booze on my breath and feel the world spinning. I tried to slow down, but my foot stayed glued to the gas pedal. Up ahead, I saw headlights coming around a curve. I screamed, trying desperately to swerve, but it was too late. There was a deafening crash, the sickening crunch of metal, and then blackness. Just like that, I was back in the junkyard, sprawled on the ground next to the Chevy. I scrambled away, my whole body shaking. What the hell just happened? It felt so real, like I had actually lived through that fatal crash. I wanted to bolt right then, but I knew Uncle Ned would kick my ass if I ditched my shift. So I tried to get back to work, telling myself it was just some crazy hallucination. But an hour later, it happened again. This time, it was a black minivan that pulled me in. I found myself in the driver's seat, a woman's hands on the wheel. In the rearview mirror, I could see two kids in the back seat. We were arguing about something, her voice shrill and angry. I felt her foot slam on the brake as a deer darted in front of us. The van skidded on the wet road, flipping over and over. I heard the children's screams, felt the sickening vertigo as we rolled. Then silence. I came to on the oily ground of the junkyard, bile rising in my throat. This couldn't be happening. These wrecked cars, these deaders, as the other workers called them, they were somehow showing me how they died. The experiences kept coming throughout the night. A blue Mazda took me through a head-on collision. A red pickup let me feel what it was like to plunge off a bridge. With each one, the details got clearer, more visceral. I could smell the burning rubber, taste the blood in my mouth. But it wasn't until the last car that I understood why this was happening to me. It was an old Crown Vic, the kind cops use. As soon as I touched it, I was transported inside. I was in the back seat this time. Up front was a big guy in a police uniform. But something was off. He was wearing a creepy red mask that covered his whole face. In the passenger seat was a teenage girl, crying and struggling against her handcuffs. "Please," she begged, "let me go. I won't tell anyone, I swear." The masked cop just laughed, a chilling sound that made my blood run cold. That's when I realized I recognized that laugh. It was Uncle Ned. I watched in horror as Ned drove down a lonely dirt road, deeper and deeper into the woods. The girl's pleas turned to screams. I wanted to help her, but I was just a helpless observer. When the car finally stopped, Ned dragged the girl out into the darkness. I heard awful sounds, her cries, the thud of fists, a sickening crack. Then silence. I snapped back to reality, falling out of the Crown Vic onto my hands and knees. I retched, my whole body shaking as the truth sank in. My Uncle Ned, the guy who'd give you the shirt off his back, was the infamous Red Death Mask killer who'd been terrorizing the Midwest for years. All those mangled cars in the yard, how many of them held similar dark secrets? How many missing persons and unsolved murders could be tied to the vehicles here? I knew I had to get out of there, had to tell someone. But as I turned to run, I found myself surrounded. Dozens of cars had silently rolled into a circle around me, their headlights blazing to life. I heard the engines roar to life, saw them start to move, but they weren't trying to hurt me. No, they were herding me, guiding me toward the center of the yard where the car crusher was. That's when I heard the dog start barking wildly. Ned's angry voice rang out as he stomped toward me. "Boy, what the hell are you doing out here?" The cars surged forward, forcing me to scramble onto the crusher's platform. Ned's eyes went wide as he saw the vehicles moving on their own. He tried to back away, but they kept coming. I watched in shock as the cars pushed and rammed Ned toward me. He fought and clawed, but he was no match for their relentless advance. With one final shove, he tumbled onto the platform next to me. The cars went still. In the silence, I heard the hydraulics of the crusher whir to life. The massive metal plates started to close in around us. "Help!" Ned screamed. "Do something, you idiot!" But I was frozen in place, my legs refusing to move. As the crusher kept closing, I saw a glint of red. Ned's mask had fallen out of his pocket. The last thing I remember is Ned's howl of pain as the metal jaws clamped down. I must have blacked out, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in the hospital. They found me unconscious next to the crusher. Inside was a twisted hunk of metal and gore that used to be my uncle. The cops say it was just a tragic industrial accident, but I know the truth. Those cars, those poor souls trapped in metal prisons, they made sure justice was served. They used me to lure Ned to his death, to make him pay for his crimes. I'm out of the hospital now, but I still have nightmares. I can't look at a car without breaking into a cold sweat. Sometimes at night, I swear I can hear the faint sound of engines and see headlights in the distance. I don't know if anyone will believe this story. Hell, most days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I experienced. Those cars were alive somehow, and they have a way of making sure karma catches up to you, one way or another. So the next time you're driving down a dark road late at night, pay attention to that junker on the side of the road. It might just have a story to tell. And trust me, you don't want to be on the wrong side of their justice. Looking back, I know I was being reckless. But in that moment, I felt invincible. I'd made this drive 100 times before, usually coming home from a long night at the bar. This time, I was stone-cold sober, just enjoying the thrill of the open road. As I rounded a bend, my headlights caught a flash of movement up ahead. Before I could even process what was happening, a massive buck leapt out onto the highway directly in my path. I yanked the wheel hard to the right, trying desperately to avoid it. Time seemed to slow down. I felt the tires lose traction as the car began to skid sideways. The world outside my windshield became a blur of trees and asphalt. Then came the first impact as the passenger side slammed into the guardrail. The force of the collision sent the car flipping end over end. I was thrown violently in my seat, held in place only by my seatbelt. Glass shattered all around me. The roof caved in, then popped back out as the car rolled. I lost all sense of up or down as the world spun wildly around me. Strangely, in those terrifying moments, the music never stopped. Lynyrd Skynyrd kept on playing as if nothing was happening. The guitar solo wailed as my car tumbled down the embankment. I don't know how many times the car flipped. It felt like an eternity. Each impact rattled my bones and left me more disoriented than the last. I remember a sharp pain in my neck during one of the rolls, then a strange numbness spreading through my body. When the car finally came to rest, it was upside down in a ditch. The engine was still running, and Free Bird continued to play from the battered speakers. I hung there suspended by my seatbelt, struggling to make sense of what had just happened. I tried to move, to unbuckle myself, but nothing happened. I couldn't feel my arms or legs. Panic started to set in as I realized I was completely paralyzed. The numbness had spread to my entire body. As I hung there, helpless, I became aware of a warm wetness spreading across my face and chest. In the dim glow of the dashboard lights, I could see dark liquid dripping upwards, my own blood flowing against gravity. My vision started to tunnel, and I knew I was fading fast. The last thing I remember hearing was the final notes of Free Bird, fading out as everything went black. The next thing I knew, I was floating above the wreckage. I could see my mangled Chevy Nova, steam rising from the crumpled hood. And there, hanging upside down in the driver's seat, was my own lifeless body. I don't know how long I hovered there, staring down at the scene in disbelief. It didn't seem real. How could that broken, bloody figure be me? I'd just been cruising down the highway without a care in the world. How could everything change so quickly? As I watched, I saw headlights approaching on the road above. A passing motorist had spotted the wreck and pulled over. I heard a car door slam and footsteps rushing down the embankment. "Oh my God," a woman's voice gasped. "Hello? Can you hear me? I'm calling 911. I wanted to tell her it was too late, that there was nothing she could do, but of course she couldn't hear me. I was just a silent observer now, powerless to interact with the world I'd left behind. More vehicles began to arrive, police cars, an ambulance, fire trucks. I watched as they worked to extract my body from the wreckage. The grim looks on their faces told me they knew it was a recovery, not a rescue. As they loaded me into a body bag, I felt a strange tugging sensation. The scene before me began to fade, replaced by a warm, bright light. I felt myself being pulled towards it, away from the physical world. But something held me back. Some part of me wasn't ready to let go just yet. I resisted the pull of the light, clinging to the familiar world I'd known. That's how I've spent the last few months, caught between two worlds, unable to move on, but also unable to return to my old life. I've watched my family and friends grieve. I've seen the police investigation conclude it was just a tragic accident. I've witnessed strangers leave flowers at the spot where I died. And through it all, I've grappled with the senselessness of it. One moment of recklessness, one split-second decision, and my entire existence was snuffed out. 40 years of life, of memories and relationships and experiences, all ended in the blink of an eye. I keep replaying that night over and over, wondering what I could have done differently. If I'd been going just a little slower, If I'd swerved left instead of right, if I'd stayed home that night, any small change could have altered the outcome. But I can't change the past. All I can do now is watch and wait, caught in this strange limbo between life and death. I don't know why I'm still here or what I'm meant to learn from this experience. Maybe I'm not ready to face whatever comes next. Maybe I'm being punished for my recklessness. Or maybe this is just what happens to everyone after they die, and we're all just floating around unseen, watching life go on without us. I wish I had answers, some profound insight into the nature of life and death. But the truth is, I'm just as confused and scared as I was in those final moments as my car tumbled down the embankment. Death, it turns out, isn't the end of uncertainty and fear. It's just the beginning of a whole new set of questions. So here I am, stuck between worlds, reliving my final moments over and over. The screech of tires, the shattering of glass, the wail of that guitar solo. They're burned into my consciousness now, an eternal loop of my last seconds on Earth. I don't know how long I'll be here or what comes next. All I know is that life is fragile, more fragile than I ever realized. One moment you're on top of the world, feeling invincible. The next, you're gone, leaving behind nothing but wreckage and grieving loved ones. If you're reading this, however you're reading this, please be careful out there. Don't take a single moment for granted. And for God's sake, slow down on those dark country roads. You never know what might be waiting around the next bend. I was driving home from work on Interstate 95, exhausted after a long day at the office. The rain was coming down in sheets, pounding against my windshield and making it hard to see more than a few car lengths ahead. My wipers were going full speed, but they could barely keep up. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, leaning forward and squinting to try to make out the road through the downpour. The clock on my dashboard read 7:43 p.m. Rush hour traffic was still heavy despite the weather, with cars zooming past me in the left lanes. As I cautiously made my way along in the right lane, I noticed a large semi-truck approaching quickly in my rearview mirror. Its headlights loomed larger and brighter as it got closer. I tensed up, wondering if the truck driver could even see my little red Honda Civic through the rain. The truck came up right behind me and started flashing its lights. I felt a flare of annoyance. What did this guy want? I was already going 5 over the speed limit despite the dangerous conditions. If he was in such a hurry, he could go around me. The truck's horn blared loudly, making me jump. Geez, what was this guy's problem? I tightened my grip on the wheel and kept going, refusing to speed up or change lanes. The rain was too heavy to try any risky maneuvers. After a few more moments, the truck started edging over into the middle lane to pass me. As it pulled alongside, I glanced over and saw the driver frantically waving and pointing ahead. My heart leapt into my throat as I snapped my attention back to the road in front of me. Through the curtain of rain, I could just make out the ghostly red glow of brake lights. Traffic had come to a standstill up ahead, and I was barreling straight toward it. I slammed on my brakes, feeling the car start to hydroplane. The anti-lock brakes pulsed under my foot as I skidded forward. Everything seemed to move in slow motion. I could see the bumper of the car ahead getting closer and closer. I braced for impact, my body going rigid. But then I felt a massive jolt from behind as the semi-truck plowed into me. The impact shoved my car forward violently. Metal crunched and glass shattered as I was sandwiched between the truck and the stopped traffic ahead. My head snapped back and forth, my seatbelt digging painfully into my chest and shoulder. The airbags exploded outward in a cloud of chalky dust. For a moment, all I could hear was the hiss of deflating airbags and the tinkle of broken glass falling. As the dust settled, I became aware of an intense, stabbing pain in my left arm. I looked down and saw a jagged piece of metal from the crumpled door had pierced through my bicep. Blood was already soaking through my sleeve. I tried to move but found myself pinned in place by the crushed frame of the car. Panic started to set in as I realized how bad the situation was. I was trapped and bleeding in a mangled wreck in the middle of a busy highway during a downpour. The smell of gasoline and burning rubber filled the air. I could hear distant shouting and car horns blaring. My chest felt tight and it was getting harder to breathe. Was I going into shock? I fumbled for my phone with my good arm, but couldn't find it in the chaos of the wreckage. Tears of pain and fear started streaming down my face. How could this be happening? If only I'd listened to that truck driver's warnings. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly as I waited, trapped and helpless. The rain continued to pour down, trickling in through the shattered windows. I was soaked and shivering, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. After what felt like hours but was probably only 15-20 minutes, I heard the wail of sirens approaching. Soon there were flashing lights all around, and I could make out the voices of first responders. "We've got a bad multi-car pileup here, at least one person trapped. We're gonna need the jaws of life." I tried to call out, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. The pain and blood loss were making me feel faint and disoriented. Suddenly there was a firefighter at my window, shining a light in and assessing the situation. "Ma'am, can you hear me? We're going to get you out of there. Just hang on." I managed a weak nod, relief flooding through me. Help was here. I was going to be okay. The next while was a blur of cutting metal, flashing lights, and people shouting instructions. At some point they got an IV started and gave me something for the pain. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they were able to extract me from the wreckage on a backboard. As they loaded me into the ambulance, I caught a glimpse of the accident scene. It was utter carnage. At least 5 or 6 vehicles were involved in addition to the semi. My little Honda was barely recognizable, crushed between 2 much larger vehicles. On the gurney, staring up at the ambulance ceiling, the full weight of what had happened started to sink in. My stubbornness and refusal to yield could have gotten me and others killed. I'd always considered myself a good, safe driver. How could I have been so reckless? The days and weeks that followed were a haze of surgeries, painkillers, and physical therapy. I had a broken arm, 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and various cuts and contusions. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive. As I slowly recovered, I couldn't stop replaying those moments on the highway in my mind. The truck trying to warn me, my stubborn refusal to move over, the moment of impact, over and over again. I found out later that miraculously, no one had died in the pileup, but there were several serious injuries, all because I'd been too proud and irritated to listen to that truck driver's warnings. It's been 6 months now since the accident. I'm mostly healed physically, though I still have some lingering pain and mobility issues with my arm. The mental scars have been slower to fade. I still have nightmares about being trapped in that crushed car, and loud noises make me jump. I don't think I'll ever be able to forget that rainy night on I-95. It was a harsh lesson in the importance of staying alert, letting go of road rage, and always erring on the side of caution. My stubbornness nearly cost me my life. I'm just grateful for the second chance I've been given, and I try to pay it forward by sharing my story as a warning to others. So please, if you're reading this, don't make the same mistake I did. When you're behind the wheel, check your ego at the door. Be willing to yield, even if you think you're in the right. And always, always pay attention to your surroundings. You never know when a split-second decision could change your life forever. Drive safe out there, folks. And remember, it's better to arrive a few minutes late than to not arrive at all. It was around 9 p.m. and I was doing some paperwork when I heard frantic pounding on the station door. I rushed over thinking maybe a hiker had gotten lost after dark. But when I opened the door, I was met with a sight that made my blood run cold. There was a man, probably in his 30s, standing there shaking and covered in blood. His clothes were torn, and he had this wild, terrified look in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Before I could even ask what happened, he stumbled inside and collapsed onto the floor, babbling incoherently. I knelt down beside him, trying to figure out what was going on and assess his injuries. He was breathing heavily and kept mumbling about creatures and attacked and not human. I couldn't make sense of it, but I knew I needed to get him help fast. As I reached for the radio to call for an ambulance, the hiker suddenly grabbed my arm with surprising strength. He locked eyes with me and said in this chilling whisper, "They came out of nowhere, in the night, stabbing through the tent with these needles. Oh God, the needles!" A shudder ran through me. I tried to stay calm and reassure him that he was safe now, but my mind was racing. What the hell had happened to this guy out there? I managed to get him onto a chair and started looking over his injuries while we waited for the ambulance. That's when I noticed how strange the wounds were. There were dozens of small puncture marks all over his body, almost too neat and uniform to be from animal bites or claws. And stranger still, the skin around the wounds had this sickly grayish tint. The hiker was going in and out of consciousness at this point. In his more lucid moments, he'd grab onto me and try to warn me about something. He kept saying they were still out there, that they'd come for me too. I didn't know what to make of it, but the raw terror in his voice sent chills down my spine. When the paramedics finally arrived, the hiker had passed out completely. As they loaded him into the ambulance, one of them remarked on how bizarre the injuries were. I overheard him say he'd never seen puncture wounds quite like that before. After they left, I knew I should probably just file a report and let the authorities handle it. But something about the whole situation felt off. I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling in my gut. Against my better judgment, I decided to go check out the hiker's campsite myself. It was close to midnight by the time I made it out to the area where he'd been camping. The full moon cast an eerie glow over the trees as I made my way down the trail. Every snapping twig or rustle in the bushes made me jump. I kept thinking about the hiker's warnings, wondering if something was really out there watching me. When I reached the campsite, my flashlight beam fell on a scene of chaos. The tent was shredded, with strange, perfectly round holes punched through the fabric. Camping gear was strewn all over, but strangest of all was the total silence. No insects chirping, no night birds, nothing. It was as if all wildlife had fled the area. I approached the mangled tent cautiously, heart pounding. As I got closer, I noticed a faint, sharp chemical smell. It reminded me of bleach or ammonia, but more acrid. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Shining my light inside the tent, I saw more of those odd puncture marks in the sleeping bag and ground mat. They formed intricate geometric patterns, almost too precise to be random. This was no ordinary animal attack. That's when I saw it, partially hidden under some torn fabric, a mask, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was maybe a foot long, vaguely face-shaped, but with proportions all wrong for a human. The material felt strange, not quite metal or plastic, with an oily sheen that seemed to shift colors as I turned it. The mask had no eye holes, just smooth surfaces where eyes should be. But the lower half, God, the lower half still haunts my dreams. It was studded with dozens of needle-like protrusions, wickedly sharp and stained with what looked horribly like dried blood. I don't know how long I stood there staring at that thing. A part of me wanted to take it as evidence, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it again. It felt wrong, alien, like it shouldn't exist in our world. Suddenly, a twig snapped loudly somewhere in the darkness beyond the campsite. I whirled around, heart racing, but saw nothing in the trees. And yet, I had the overwhelming sensation of being watched. The silence felt oppressive now, like the whole forest was holding its breath. That's when I heard it. A low thrumming noise, almost subsonic, more felt than heard. It seemed to be coming from all directions at once, growing in intensity. The air took on a strange electric quality that made my skin prickle. I don't remember deciding to run. One moment I was rooted to the spot in terror. The next, I was crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping my face as I fled back towards the ranger station. I could swear I heard movement in the woods around me, keeping pace, but I didn't dare look back. I made it back to the station and locked myself inside, shaking and gasping for breath. As the night wore on, I kept vigil by the window, jumping at every shadow, but nothing came. When dawn finally broke, I headed back out to the campsite with a team to gather evidence, but there was nothing there. The shredded tent, the strange mask, all of it was gone without a trace. If I didn't have the cuts and bruises from my panicked flight through the woods, I might have thought I'd imagined the whole thing. We never found out what really happened that night. The hiker recovered physically, but was diagnosed with severe PTSD and couldn't remember details of the attack. The official report blamed it on a bear encounter, but I know what I saw. Those weren't bear claws that shredded that tent or left those precision punctures. Sometimes late at night, when I'm alone in the station, I still hear that thrumming noise on the edge of perception, and I wonder what's really out there in the darkness of the forest, waiting. It was supposed to be a routine patrol. My partner Jake and I were doing our usual rounds, checking on campsites and making sure everything was in order. The morning had started off normal enough, cool and misty, with the sounds of birds chirping as the forest slowly woke up. As we approached Moose Lake, I noticed something odd. There was an eerie silence, like all the wildlife had suddenly vanished. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "You hear that?" I whispered to Jake. He nodded, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. We cautiously made our way down to the shoreline, scanning for any signs of disturbance. That's when I saw it. Nestled in the mud at the water's edge was the strangest object I'd ever encountered. It was some kind of egg, about the size of a football, but jet black and smooth as polished obsidian. As I crouched down to examine it closer, I realized with a jolt that it was warm to the touch. Not just warm, but pulsing with heat, like a beating heart. "What the hell is that thing?" Jake said, his voice tinged with alarm. I shook my head, at a loss for words. In all my years as a forest ranger, I'd never seen anything like it. "I have no idea, but we can't just leave it here." Jake's eyes widened. "You're not seriously thinking of taking that thing with us, are you? We have no clue what it is or where it came from." He had a point, but something inside me couldn't bear the thought of abandoning this mysterious object. What if it was some kind of rare, undiscovered species? As a conservationist, I felt a duty to protect it and learn more. We'll take it back to the station for now, I said firmly, at least until we can figure out what to do with it. Jake clearly wasn't happy about it, but he knew better than to argue when I had my mind set on something. I carefully wrapped the egg in my jacket and placed it in my pack. As we hiked back to our truck, I could feel the heat radiating through the fabric. Back at the ranger station, I cleared out a small refrigerator we used for biological samples and gently placed the egg inside. The chill didn't seem to affect it. I could still feel that eerie warmth emanating from its glossy surface. I really think we should call this in, Jake said uneasily. Get some experts out here to take a look. I hesitated. Part of me knew he was right, but another part wanted to keep this discovery to ourselves, at least for now. Let's give it a day or two, I said. See if anything changes. Then we'll decide what to do. Jake reluctantly agreed, but I could tell he was uncomfortable with the whole situation. As we finished up our shift, I found myself constantly distracted, my thoughts returning to that strange black egg. What could it be? Where had it come from? And why did I feel so inexplicably drawn to it? That night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Around 3 a.m., I gave up and drove back to the station. I told myself I just wanted to check on the egg, make sure everything was okay. But deep down, I knew there was more to it than that. As I approached the refrigerator, my heart started racing. The egg seemed to be glowing faintly, a soft purple light pulsing from within. I reached out to touch it, mesmerized by its otherworldly beauty. The moment my fingers made contact, a jolt of electricity shot through my body. Vivid alien images flooded my mind, vast dark oceans, writhing tentacles, cities of impossible geometry. I yanked my hand back with a gasp, my whole body shaking. What the hell was happening? This was so far beyond anything I could comprehend. I knew then that I was in way over my head. With trembling hands, I grabbed several cinder blocks we kept for construction projects and started stacking them around the refrigerator, sealing the egg inside. As the sun began to rise, I sat in my truck, trying to process what I'd experienced. I knew I needed to tell someone, get help. But who would believe me? I was still struggling to believe it myself. I was jolted out of my thoughts by the sound of vehicles approaching, several large black SUVs with tinted windows. My stomach dropped as they pulled up in front of the station. This couldn't be good. A group of men in dark suits emerged, led by a stern-faced woman with close-cropped gray hair. They moved with purpose, like they knew exactly why they were here. "Forest Ranger Clark?" the woman asked as she approached me. I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. "I'm Agent Simmons with the SCP Foundation. We're here about the anomalous object you discovered yesterday." My mind reeled. How did they know? We hadn't told anyone. "I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered, but it was clear from her expression that she wasn't buying it. "Mr. Clark, we take these matters very seriously. I suggest you cooperate fully. Where is the object?" I hesitated, but I knew I was out of my depth here. Whatever that egg was, it was beyond my ability to handle. With a heavy sigh, I led them to the refrigerator. The team worked quickly and efficiently, carefully extracting the egg and placing it in some kind of high-tech containment unit. Agent Simmons pulled me aside as they loaded it into one of the SUVs. "I need you to understand the gravity of this situation," she said, her voice low and intense. "What you've encountered here is something that could pose a significant threat to global security if mishandled. You did the right thing by containing it, but this is now a matter for our organization." She handed me a card with nothing but a phone number on it. "If you experience any unusual symptoms or recall any additional details about your encounter, call this number immediately. Do not discuss what happened here with anyone. For your own safety and the safety of others, this incident never occurred. Do you understand?" I nodded numbly, watching as they drove away with the mysterious egg. As the dust settled, I was left with a profound sense of unease. What had I stumbled upon? And what were the ramifications of my discovery? In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd glimpsed something I was never meant to see, a hidden layer of reality that most people go their whole lives without encountering. Jake never brought up the incident again, and I got the sense he'd been warned to keep quiet too. Life at the ranger station returned to normal, or at least a semblance of it. But I knew I'd been changed forever by what I'd experienced. Sometimes in my dreams, I still see those alien visions, vast and terrifying and beautiful. I wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of otherworldly whispers fading in my ears. And I wonder what might have happened if I'd kept that egg to myself, if I'd let my curiosity override my common sense. I'll never know for sure what was inside that black egg or where it came from. But one thing's for certain, there are things in this world, and perhaps beyond it, that defy explanation. And sometimes it's better not to go looking for answers to questions we're not prepared to face. I was on a routine patrol with my partner Clark in the National Forest when we got a call about 2 missing campers from Tennessee. Their names were Rachel and John, and they hadn't checked in with family for a couple days. We headed out to their last known campsite to investigate. The sun was starting to set as we hiked deeper into the woods. I had an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The forest was eerily quiet, no birds chirping or insects buzzing, just dead silence. As we approached the campsite, I noticed strange markings on some of the trees. They almost looked like claw marks, but larger than any animal I'd seen before. Clark saw them too, and we exchanged a worried glance. We finally reached the clearing where the campers had set up their tent. At first glance, everything looked normal. The tent was still standing, and their gear was scattered around the site. But as we got closer, I noticed dark stains on the outside of the tent that looked disturbingly like blood. "Hello? Rachel? John? Park Rangers here, just checking to make sure you're okay," Clark called out. No response. We cautiously approached the tent, my hand resting on my sidearm. As we got closer, I could hear muffled sounds coming from inside, a mix of whimpering and weird clicking noises. Clark slowly unzipped the tent flap. What I saw inside will haunt me for the rest of my life. Rachel and John were huddled in the back of the tent, eyes wide with terror. But surrounding them were the most horrific creatures I've ever seen. They were about the size of large dogs, with segmented insect-like bodies. But the worst part was their faces. They had grotesque, twisted human faces with bulging eyes and gaping mouths full of needle-like teeth. The creatures turned to look at us and let out an unearthly shriek. In an instant, they lunged toward us. I stumbled backwards in shock, fumbling for my gun. Clark managed to fire off a shot, hitting one of the creatures. It exploded in a spray of greenish goo. "Run!" I yelled to the campers. They scrambled out of the tent as more of the monsters poured out after them. Everything was chaos. The creatures were incredibly fast, skittering around on too many legs. I fired my gun wildly, trying to keep them at bay. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw one latch onto John's leg. He screamed in agony as it plunged a needle-like proboscis into his flesh, drinking his blood. I ran over and kicked the thing as hard as I could. It went flying into a tree with a sickening crunch. John collapsed to the ground, his leg a bloody mess. I helped him up, and we stumbled towards where Clark was holding off more of the creatures. "We need to get out of here now," Clark yelled. We started to retreat back the way we came, half carrying John between us. Rachel was sobbing hysterically. The creatures pursued us relentlessly through the darkening forest. Every time I glanced back, I saw more of their hideous faces emerging from the shadows. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly, but sheer terror kept me going. We finally broke through the tree line into a clearing. Our ranger truck was parked about 50 yards away. "Almost there," I gasped. Suddenly, one of the creatures leapt out of the bushes right in front of us. Before I could react, it pounced on Rachel. She shrieked as its needle mouth plunged into her shoulder. I grabbed a heavy branch from the ground and smashed it over the creature's body again and again until it stopped moving. We made it to the truck and piled in, slamming the doors behind us. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking violently. The engine roared to life just as the creatures swarmed around us, their human-like faces pressed against the windows. I floored it, bouncing wildly down the forest road. The creatures chased us for a while, but eventually fell behind. We didn't slow down until we reached the main highway. John and Rachel were in bad shape. We rushed them to the hospital where they were treated for blood loss and trauma. Physically, they recovered. Mentally, I'm not so sure. I don't think any of us will ever be the same after what we saw that day. We told our supervisors what happened, but they didn't believe us. Said we must have been exposed to some kind of hallucinogenic plant or something. They did a half-hearted search of the area, but found no sign of the creatures. Sometimes I wonder if it was all just a shared delusion. But then I look at the scars on my arms from where their claws raked me, and I know it was real. Those things are still out there somewhere, waiting, watching, hungry. I can't sleep most nights. Every time I close my eyes, I see those twisted human faces with their needle teeth. I keep wondering, where did they come from? Are they some kind of mutant hybrid, a government experiment gone wrong, or something not from this world? I've tried to move on with my life, but I can't shake the feeling that this isn't over, that someday those creatures will return, and next time we might not be so lucky. For now, all I can do is try to warn others. If you're planning a camping trip, please be careful, stay alert, and if you hear strange clicking noises in the night, run. Run as fast as you can and don't look back. It's been months since that day, but I still jump at every shadow. The doctors say I have PTSD. They've got me on all kinds of meds, but nothing helps. How can I explain to them that the monsters under the bed are real? Clark quit the Rangers not long after, said he couldn't handle being in the woods anymore. I don't blame him. Part of me wants to quit too, but I feel like I need to stay, to keep watch, to be ready. I've done some research, trying to find any similar reports or sightings. So far, nothing concrete. But there are whispers, stories of missing hikers and campers, strange markings found on trees, the occasional blurry photo that could be something. I've started keeping a gun by my bed. I know it probably won't do much good against those things, but it helps me sleep a little better. I've also stocked up on first aid supplies and blood transfusion kits, just in case. Sometimes I think about trying to track down Rachel and John to see how they're coping. But I'm afraid of what I might find. What if the creatures somehow infected them? What if they've changed? I find myself constantly checking the news for any strange reports, animal attacks, missing persons, unexplained phenomena, anything that might hint at the creature's return. So far, nothing. but I can't shake the feeling that it's only a matter of time. I've thought about going public with our story, but who would believe me? I'd probably end up in a padded room. And even if people did believe, what then? Mass panic? Government cover-ups? I don't know what the right answer is. All I know is that the world is a much darker, scarier place than I ever realized. There are things out there beyond our comprehension, things that shouldn't exist, and they're hungry. So I'll keep watching, keep waiting, and hope that somehow, some way, we'll be ready when they come back. Because they will come back. Of that, I have no doubt. If you're reading this, please be careful out there. The monsters are real, and they wear our faces. I remember sitting on our rickety front porch as a kid, listening to my grandpa rail against the pigs who'd locked up his son. The venom in his voice made a deep impression. By the time I was a teenager, I was following in my family's footsteps, joy riding in stolen cars, vandalism, petty theft. Nothing too serious, but enough to put me on a collision course with the law. Everything changed the night of July 15th, 2 summers ago. Me and my best friend Cade were cruising down back roads, a couple beers in us, not a care in the world. We were doing 80 in a 45 when we hit that curve. I still hear the screech of tires, feel the sickening lurch as we spun out of control. The world turned upside down as we rolled over and over. When the dust settled, I was hanging upside down, seatbelt digging into my chest. My head was spinning, blood dripping into my eyes. But all I could think about was Cade. He wasn't moving or making a sound. I don't know how long we were trapped there before I heard sirens approaching. Fear gripped me, not of injury or death, but of getting arrested. As the flashing lights drew closer, I actually considered trying to flee the scene. But then I heard a voice calling out, asking if we were okay. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and there he was, Officer Dan Holbrook. I'll never forget the look of concern on his face as he assessed the situation. He talked to me calmly, keeping me conscious as he radioed for backup and emergency services. When I started to panic about Cade, Officer Holbrook crawled into the wreckage to check on him. He found a pulse, weak but there. What happened next is mostly a blur. The jaws of life tearing open the car, being loaded into an ambulance, drifting in and out of consciousness at the hospital. But one thing stands out crystal clear. Officer Holbrook staying by our sides through it all, comforting our families, making sure we got the care we needed. I walked away from that crash with a concussion, some broken ribs, and a completely shattered worldview. Cade was in a coma for 2 weeks, but he pulled through. And it was all thanks to that cop I'd been raised to hate. In the months that followed, as Cade and I recovered, I couldn't stop thinking about Officer Holbrook, about how he'd saved our lives without a second thought, about the compassion and professionalism he showed. It was so at odds with everything I'd been taught about police. I started doing some soul-searching, questioning the attitudes I'd grown up with. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I wanted to be like Officer Holbrook. I wanted to make a difference in people's lives, to protect and serve my community. When I told my family I was thinking of applying to the police academy, you'd have thought I'd announced I was joining a cult. My daddy, fresh out of his latest stint in county, looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "Boy, have you lost your goddamn mind?" he growled. My mama just burst into tears, like I'd told her I had cancer or something. My brothers alternated between mocking me and trying to talk me out of it. And my grandpa, he damn near had a heart attack. Told me if I put on that uniform, I'd be dead to him. but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was what I was meant to do. For the first time in my life, I had a sense of purpose. So despite the protests and threats from my family, despite losing some friendships, I enrolled in the academy. It wasn't easy. The physical demands were brutal, and the academic side challenged me in ways school never had. There were plenty of times I thought about quitting, but every time I wavered, I thought about Officer Holbrook, about Cade in that hospital bed, and I pushed through. Graduation day was bittersweet. I'd never been so proud of myself, but looking out at the audience, the faces of my family were conspicuously absent. Only Cade was there, cheering me on. My first posting was to a small town in the Appalachian Mountains of East Tennessee. It was a far cry from the mean streets you see in cop shows, but it came with its own unique challenges. Poverty, drug abuse, domestic violence, all the ugly realities of rural life that I'd grown up with, now seen from the other side of the law. Those first few months on the job were eye-opening. I quickly realized that being a good cop was about so much more than just enforcing laws. It was about being a counselor, a mediator, sometimes even a social worker. Every day brought new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. I'll never forget my first domestic violence call. Pulling up to that run-down trailer, hearing the screams from inside, my heart was racing. As I approached the door, I could hear my daddy's voice in my head, calling me a traitor. But then I thought of Officer Holbrook, of the lives he'd saved that night. I took a deep breath and knocked. The scene inside was chaos. A drunk, violent husband, a terrified wife, kids crying in the corner. In that moment, all my training kicked in. I managed to defuse the situation, get the wife and kids to safety, and take the husband into custody without anyone getting hurt. As I drove back to the station that night, I felt a mix of emotions I'd never experienced before. Pride in a job well done, sadness for the family torn apart by violence, and a fierce determination to keep working, keep helping, keep making a difference. It hasn't all been smooth sailing. There have been times when the job has tested me to my limits. The first time I had to draw my weapon, the night I lost a victim despite my best efforts to save them. The constant struggle to maintain my humanity in the face of the worst aspects of human nature. And then there's my family. Most of them still won't speak to me. My daddy spits on the ground when he sees me in uniform. But my mama, she's starting to come around. Last Christmas, she actually hugged me and told me she was proud. Baby steps, I guess. Cade's been my rock through all of this. He's the one person who truly understands the journey I've been on. We still get together to watch the game and throw back a few beers, responsibly, of course. Sometimes we talk about that night, about how close we came to the edge. And every time, he thanks me for becoming the kind of person who might save someone else's life someday. It's been 2 years since I first put on the badge, and I still wake up every morning excited to go to work. Sure, there are hard days. Days when I question if I'm really making a difference. But then I'll help a lost kid find their way home, or talk a suicidal teen off the ledge, or yes, even write a speeding ticket that might prevent another accident like the one that changed my life. In those moments, I know I made the right choice. I may have lost my family's approval, but I've gained something far more valuable, a sense of purpose, a way to give back to my community, and the knowledge that every day I have the opportunity to be someone's Officer Holbrook. I'm not naive. I know there are problems in law enforcement, systemic issues that need addressing, but I also know that change has to start somewhere. And maybe, just maybe, by being the kind of cop I wish I'd known growing up, I can be part of that change. So here I am, a small-town cop in the mountains of Tennessee, with a family history on the wrong side of the law, trying to make a difference one day at a time. It's not the life I ever imagined for myself, but it's a life I'm proud of. And who knows, maybe someday, some kid from a family like mine will look at me the way I looked at Officer Holbrook, and maybe, just maybe, the cycle will break for good. I remember checking my watch, 11:47 p.m. Less than 15 minutes left on my shift. I was already daydreaming about getting home, kicking off my boots, and falling into bed. That's when it happened. A small figure suddenly appeared in my headlights, standing motionless in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. There was a sickening thud as I hit something. My heart racing, I threw the car into park and jumped out, expecting the worst. But there was nothing there. No body, no blood, not even a dent in my cruiser. I stood there in shock, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as I searched for any sign of what I'd hit. It didn't make sense. I knew I'd hit something. I'd felt the impact. That's when I heard it. A soft giggle coming from behind me. I whirled around, my hand instinctively going to my holster. There, standing no more than 10 feet away, was a young boy. He looked to be about 9 or 10 years old, with pale skin and dark hair, but something was off about him. His posture was too stiff, his smile too wide, and his eyes. I'll never forget those eyes as long as I live. They were completely, utterly black. No whites, no irises, just endless pools of darkness that seemed to swallow my flashlight beam. I felt a chill run down my spine as he stared at me, still grinning that unnatural grin. "Are you okay?" I managed to choke out, my police training kicking in despite my fear. "Where are your parents?" The boy didn't answer. He just kept staring, his head tilted slightly to one side. Then, in a voice that sounded far too old for his small body, he spoke. "Officer Michelle, we've been waiting for you." I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. How did he know my name? I hadn't introduced myself, and my name tag was hidden under my jacket. Before I could respond, the boy took a step toward me. His movements were jerky, almost robotic. "Let me in," he said, his grin widening impossibly. "I just want to play." Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I stood my ground. "Kid, I don't know what's going on here, but you need to tell me where your parents are. It's not safe for you to be out here alone." The boy's grin faded, replaced by a look of cold anger that no child should be capable of. I said, "Let me in." His voice had dropped an octave, becoming a guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. Suddenly, he lunged at me with inhuman speed. I barely had time to react before he was on me, his small hands gripping my arms with impossible strength. I struggled to break free, but it was like fighting against steel cables. His face was inches from mine now, those black eyes boring into my soul. "Let me in." Each word was punctuated by a tightening of his grip. I could feel bruises forming under his fingers. In desperation, I managed to wrench one arm free and shove him away. He flew backward with far more force than I'd used, landing several feet away. But instead of hitting the ground, he seemed to flicker like a bad TV signal. Then he was gone. I stood there, panting and shaking, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it all? Was I losing my mind? I stumbled back to my cruiser, fumbling for the radio to call for backup. But as I reached for the mic, I froze. There, in the rearview mirror, was the boy, sitting in the back seat, grinning that terrible grin. I screamed and bolted from the car, running blindly into the darkness. I could hear his laughter echoing behind me, getting closer no matter how fast I ran. My lungs were burning, my legs aching, but terror kept me going. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. Eventually, I collapsed by the side of the road, gasping for air. As I lay there, I realized the laughter had stopped. Cautiously, I lifted my head and looked around. The road was empty. No sign of the boy, no sound except for my own ragged breathing. Slowly, painfully, I got to my feet and started walking back toward my cruiser. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I dozed off at the wheel and had some kind of vivid nightmare. Maybe the stress of the job was finally getting to me. As I approached my car, I saw that the back door was open. My heart pounding, I carefully looked inside. Empty. No boy, no sign that anyone had been there. I slumped against the car, relief washing over me. That's when I noticed the bruises on my arms. Perfect handprints, far too small to be an adult's, but dark and painful. This was real. It had all been real. I drove back to the station in a daze, my report vague and disjointed. I couldn't bring myself to tell the full story. Who would believe me? I took a few days off, trying to convince myself it had all been some kind of hallucination. But it wasn't over. Over the next few weeks, I kept seeing him. Glimpses out of the corner of my eye as I patrolled. That high, eerie giggle echoing down empty hallways at the station. Once, I woke up in the middle of the night to find him standing at the foot of my bed, those black eyes gleaming in the darkness. Each time, he'd vanish as soon as I tried to confront him. I was a wreck. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. My colleagues noticed, but I brushed off their concerns. How could I explain what was happening? They'd think I was crazy. Hell, I was starting to think I was crazy. It all came to a head about 2 months after that first encounter. I was driving home after another late shift, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. As I approached the bridge that led into town, I saw a small figure standing in the middle of the road. My heart nearly stopped. It was him, the boy with the black eyes. He was just standing there, smiling that unnatural smile. I slammed on the brakes, but this time I was determined to end this. I got out of the car, my hand on my weapon. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear and anger. The boy's smile widened. "I told you, Officer Michel. I just want to play." Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet began to shake. I heard a terrible groaning sound, and to my horror, I realized the bridge was collapsing. Cracks spiderwebbed across the pavement, chunks of concrete falling into the river below. I turned to run back to my car, but it was too late. The road gave way beneath me, and I felt myself falling. The last thing I saw was the boy's face, those black eyes watching impassively as I plummeted toward the water. I don't know how I survived. By some miracle, I was pulled from the river, battered and half-drowned but alive. The official report blamed the bridge collapse on structural failure, but I know the truth. It was him, the boy with the black eyes. It's been months since that night, and I haven't seen him since. But I know he's out there, waiting. Sometimes when I'm driving down a dark road late at night, I catch myself scanning the shadows, half expecting to see that small figure appear in my headlights. I don't know what he is or what he wants. All I know is that our encounter changed me forever. I've left the force, moved to a new town, tried to start over. But I can't shake the feeling that this isn't over. That someday, when I least expect it, I'll hear that soft giggle again, and those black eyes will be waiting for me in the darkness. So if you're driving down a lonely road late at night and you see a small figure appear in your headlights, don't stop, don't get out of your car, and whatever you do, don't let him in. Because once those black eyes set their sights on you, there's no escape. They'll find you, no matter where you run, and they'll keep finding you until the day they finally decide it's time to play. I never thought I'd be writing this, but I need to get it off my chest. I'm still shaken up and struggling to make sense of what happened. It all started a few weeks ago when I got a call about an elderly man named Casey who kept reporting strange noises and creatures in his basement. As a police officer in a small town, I've dealt with my fair share of odd complaints, but something about Casey's desperate tone made me take it more seriously. When I arrived at Casey's rundown house on the outskirts of town, he was visibly agitated, pacing back and forth on his porch. "Officer, thank God you're here," he said, his eyes wide. "They're back. I can hear them scratching around down there." I'd been warned that Casey had a history of paranoia, but as I followed him inside, I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. The house was dimly lit and cluttered, with newspapers covering most of the windows. Casey led me to the basement door, his hand shaking as he turned the knob. I haven't been down there in days," he stammered, too scared. The basement was cold and damp, lit only by a single bare bulb swinging overhead. At first glance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just the usual basement clutter. But then I noticed it, a small hole in the corner, partially hidden behind some boxes. "That's where they come from," Casey whispered, pointing a trembling finger. I approached cautiously, shining my flashlight into the opening. To my shock, instead of seeing dirt or foundation, the beam illuminated what looked like a rough-hewn tunnel stretching into darkness. "What the hell?" I muttered, leaning in for a closer look. That's when I heard it, a faint scratching sound echoing from deep within the tunnel. Casey grabbed my arm. "You hear that? I told you. We need to seal it up before they get out." Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate further. "Stay here," I told Casey as I began to squeeze through the opening. The tunnel was narrow and jagged, forcing me to crouch as I made my way forward. The air grew colder and damper with each step. After about 20 feet, the passage opened up into a larger cavern. My flashlight beam danced across glistening rock walls covered in strange, pale fungus. That's when I saw it, a flash of movement in my peripheral vision. I swung my light in that direction and froze. There, peering out from behind a rock formation, was a face, but not a human face. It was chalky white and nearly translucent, with huge, milky eyes that reflected my flashlight beam. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. The creature let out a high-pitched shriek that echoed through the cavern. Suddenly, more shapes began emerging from the shadows. Dozens of them, all pale and eyeless, scurrying towards me with unnatural speed. Panic overtook me and I turned to run, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I sprinted back through the tunnel. I could hear the creatures right behind me, their claws scraping against the rock. I burst out of the hole, gasping for air. "Run!" I yelled at Casey, who was still waiting in the basement. His eyes widened in terror as he saw what was pursuing me. We raced up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind us. But it wouldn't hold for long. I could already hear them beginning to claw their way through the tunnel opening. "Is there another way out?" I asked frantically. Casey nodded, leading me to a back door. We ran outside into the cool night air, not stopping until we reached my patrol car parked out front. As I fumbled for my keys, I glanced back at the house. Pale, elongated shapes were crawling out of the windows and doors. In the moonlight, I could see them more clearly. Humanoid but wrong, with papery skin stretched over emaciated frames and those horrible blank eyes. I finally got the car started and peeled away, tires squealing. In the rearview mirror, I saw the creatures swarming over Casey's house like ants. "What the hell were those things?" I gasped, still trying to catch my breath. Casey just shook his head, his face ashen. I tried to tell people. No one believed me. I radioed for backup as I sped towards the station, but I knew no one would believe this without seeing it themselves, and part of me hoped they never would. But it wasn't over. As we neared the town, I noticed strange, pale shapes darting between buildings and alleyways. They had spread beyond Casey's property, emerging from storm drains and manholes. "Oh, God," Casey moaned. "It's too late." I made a split-second decision and swerved onto a dirt road leading into the hills outside town. We needed to get away, to regroup and figure out what to do. After a few miles, the road ended at the entrance to an old mining tunnel. "We can hide in there," I said, though the idea of going underground again filled me with dread. We cautiously entered the tunnel, which opened into a large cavern after about 50 yards. The beam of my flashlight reflected off a subterranean lake that filled most of the space. Suddenly, we heard that awful shrieking echoing from the tunnel behind us. They had followed us. "We have to swim across," I said, gesturing to the lake. "It's our only chance." Casey nodded grimly, and we waded into the frigid water. As we swam, I shone my light into the depths and almost gasped in shock. The lake was teeming with bizarre, eyeless fish, their translucent bodies clearly visible in the beam. We were about halfway across when I heard splashing behind us. Glancing back, I saw dozens of the pale creatures entering the water in pursuit, their milky eyes gleaming. "Hurry!" I yelled to Casey, who was struggling to keep up. We finally reached the far shore, hauling ourselves out of the water. I could see a narrow passage leading upward and prayed it would take us to the surface. As we stumbled up the sloping tunnel, I heard the creatures emerging from the lake behind us. Their inhuman shrieks echoed off the walls as they gave chase. The passage grew steeper and narrower, slowing our progress. I could hear the scraping of claws on rock getting closer and closer. Just when I thought we couldn't go on, I felt a blast of fresh air. The tunnel opened onto a steep hillside overlooking the town below. We emerged into the pre-dawn light, gasping and shivering. Looking back, I saw pale shapes retreating into the darkness of the tunnel opening, shrinking away from the sun. Casey and I sat there on that hillside for a long time, trying to process what had happened. As the sun rose, we could see plumes of smoke rising from several buildings in town. Sirens echoed in the distance. I knew we would have to go back eventually, to face whatever was happening and try to stop it. But in that moment, we just sat in silence, dreading what was to come. It's been weeks now, and I still wake up in a cold sweat, imagining those eyeless faces emerging from the shadows. The official explanation is that it was all mass hysteria triggered by a gas leak. But I know the truth, and I know those creatures are still down there, in the darkness beneath our feet, waiting. It all started about 2 months ago. I've owned this small farm for nearly a decade now, mostly raising chickens and a modest herd of cattle. It's not much, but it's been enough to make a living. Things were going fine until I started noticing some of my chickens going missing. At first, I thought it might be coyotes or some other predator, but the way the chickens disappeared was strange. There were no signs of forced entry to the coop, no blood or feathers left behind. They just vanished without a trace. After losing about a dozen chickens over the course of a week, I decided to install some security cameras around the property. Nothing fancy, just a few motion-activated trail cams to try and catch whatever was taking my birds. I set them up around the chicken coop and barn, figuring that would cover the most likely areas. For the first few nights, the cameras didn't pick up anything unusual, just some raccoons and possums scurrying about. nothing that could explain the missing chickens. But on the fourth night, that's when things took a terrifying turn. I woke up early the next morning to check the cameras as usual. As I scrolled through the footage, my blood ran cold. There, on the grainy nighttime video, was something. A creature standing near the chicken coop. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with a hulking, misshapen body. I could make out what looked like tangled, matted fur covering most of its form. But the most chilling details were its face and head. 2 large, curved horns protruded from its skull, and its face seemed to be a mess of exposed muscle and sinew, like its skin had been flayed off. I sat there staring at the screen in disbelief, my hands shaking. What the hell was that thing? It couldn't be real, could it? But as I kept watching, I saw it reach out with unnaturally long arms and rip the padlock clean off the coop door. It disappeared inside for a few minutes, then emerged carrying several limp chicken bodies. The creature loped off into the darkness, and that was the last I saw of it that night. I must have watched that footage 100 times that day, trying to convince myself it was some kind of hoax or malfunction. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. That night, I barely slept a wink. I kept imagining that thing lurking just outside my bedroom window, waiting to break in. The next morning, I called the sheriff's office to report what I'd seen. They sent a couple deputies out, but of course they were skeptical. I showed them the video, but they brushed it off as probably just some teenager in a costume playing a prank. They clearly thought I was overreacting or seeing things. I wanted to scream at them to take it seriously, but I knew how crazy it all sounded. For the next week, I was on edge constantly. I triple-checked all the locks, kept a loaded shotgun by my bed, and hardly slept. But the cameras didn't pick up the creature again. I was starting to wonder if maybe I really had imagined or misinterpreted what I saw. Then came the night that changed everything. I remember it was a Wednesday, unseasonably warm for October. I'd gone to bed around 10 p.m., exhausted from days of stress and insomnia. I must have fallen into a deep sleep, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by an ear-splitting shriek from outside. My heart pounding, I scrambled for the shotgun and ran to the window. What I saw in the moonlight will be seared into my brain forever. That creature, that horrifying, impossible thing, was in the cattle pasture. But this time, it wasn't just stealing chickens. No, it was in a frenzy, ripping and tearing at my cows with inhuman strength. I could hear bones snapping and flesh tearing as it eviscerated the poor animals. I was frozen in terror for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then my survival instincts kicked in. I had to get out of there. I threw on shoes and a jacket, grabbed my phone and car keys, and made a run for my truck. As I sprinted across the yard, I heard another blood-curdling shriek behind me. I dared a glance over my shoulder and saw the creature had spotted me. It was charging across the field on all fours, moving with terrifying speed. I've never run so fast in my life. I practically dove into the truck, fumbling with shaking hands to get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life just as a tremendous impact rocked the vehicle. Claws raked across the driver's side window, spider-webbing the glass. I stomped on the gas and peeled out down the long driveway, gravel flying. In the rearview mirror, I could see the creature chasing after me for a few hundred yards before it gave up and faded into the darkness. I didn't slow down until I hit the highway. I drove straight to the sheriff's office, still in my pajamas and probably looking like a madman. This time, they took me more seriously. They sent multiple units out to the farm, and I rode along in one of the cruisers. But when we got there, The scene was like something out of a nightmare. My entire herd of cattle, over 30 animals, had been brutally slaughtered. Carcasses and pieces of carcasses were strewn across the blood-soaked pasture. The smell of death was overwhelming. What was even more chilling was that all the security cameras had been destroyed, not just turned off or disabled, but literally ripped from their mounts and smashed to pieces. And strangest of all, when they checked the camera memory cards, there was a gap in all the footage. Every single camera had stopped recording at exactly midnight and didn't start again until 4 a.m. Whatever happened in those 4 hours, there was no video evidence of it. The investigation that followed was extensive, but ultimately fruitless. No one could explain what had killed my cattle with such savage force. There were no tracks, no hair or tissue samples, nothing to indicate what kind of animal could have done this. The working theory became that it must have been some kind of cult or group of psychopaths, but that didn't explain the incredible strength needed to tear apart full-grown cows or the impossible creature I'd seen on camera. I couldn't bring myself to stay at the farm after that. I moved in with my sister in the city and put the property up for sale. But even now, months later, I have nightmares about that thing. I wake up in a cold sweat, imagining those soulless eyes and twisted horns looming over my bed. I don't know what that creature was or where it came from. I don't know why it targeted my farm or if it's still out there somewhere. All I know is that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that shouldn't exist but somehow do, and I pray I never encounter anything like it ever again. I had just graduated from the police academy and was thrilled to start my first real assignment in Rondeville, a tiny town nestled in Wayne National Forest. It seemed like the perfect place to cut my teeth as a rookie cop. Quiet, peaceful, not much crime to speak of. Boy, was I wrong. It was a crisp fall morning when the call came in about Natalie Briarwood. She was a local girl, early 20s, who had gone for a hike in the forest the day before and never returned. Search and rescue efforts were already underway, but they needed all hands on deck to comb the dense woods. I remember feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness as I geared up. This was my first real case, a chance to prove myself. If only I had known what I was walking into. The forest was eerily still as our search party spread out. No birds chirping, no rustling in the underbrush, just an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow up every sound. I tried to shake off the goosebumps rising on my arms. "Focus, Daniel," I told myself. "You've got a job to do." As the hours dragged on with no sign of Natalie, an unsettling feeling started to creep over me. It was like we were being watched, but every time I whipped around to look, there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows. Then I heard it, my own voice, echoing through the trees. "Hello? Is anyone there?" But I hadn't said a word. I froze, heart pounding. The voice came again, this time from behind me. "Hello? Natalie?" I spun around, gun drawn, but there was no one, just emptiness and that unnatural silence. My hands were shaking as I radioed the others. "Did anyone else hear that? A voice calling out?" Static crackled through the radio. Then, "Negative, Thompson. No voices here. You all right?" I swallowed hard. "Yeah, must have been the wind or something," I lied. But I knew what I'd heard. My own voice, clear as day, coming from the forest around me. As daylight started to fade, panic set in. We needed to find Natalie before dark. That's when I spotted something through the trees, a flash of bright blue, the color of the jacket Natalie had been wearing. "Over here," I shouted, crashing through the underbrush. As I got closer, my stomach dropped. The blue fabric was snagged on a fallen tree, and underneath, I'll never forget the sight of Natalie's body, or the overpowering stench of decay that hit me. She was partially hidden under the massive trunk, her limbs bent at unnatural angles. But the thing that haunts me most was her face, or rather, the lack of one. The flesh had rotted away, leaving behind a grinning skull with empty eye sockets that seemed to stare right through me. I stumbled back, retching. This couldn't be right. Natalie had only been missing for a day. There was no way decomposition could have progressed this far so quickly. The next few hours were a blur of flashing lights, crime scene tape, and questions I couldn't answer. How long had she really been out here? What could cause a body to decompose so rapidly? And those voices I'd heard, was I losing my mind? The official report ruled Natalie's death an accident. She must have been hiking alone, they said, when the tree fell and crushed her. But that didn't explain the advanced state of decay or the other weird things I'd experienced in those woods. I tried to push for further investigation, but it was like hitting a brick wall. The state police swooped in and shut everything down faster than I'd ever seen. Within days, the case was closed and filed away. But I couldn't let it go. Something wasn't right about the whole situation. I started digging, asking questions, trying to piece together what really happened to Natalie Briarwood. That's when the strange occurrences started. Phone calls in the middle of the night. Nothing but static and what sounded like whispering on the other end. Shadows moving in my peripheral vision when I was alone. And always that feeling of being watched. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom window wide open, leaves scattered across the floor, as if the forest itself had crept inside while I slept. But I live on the third floor of my apartment building. There's no way anyone could have gotten in. I know how this all sounds. Believe me, I've questioned my own sanity more times than I can count. But I know what I experienced out there in those woods. Something happened to Natalie Briarwood, something that defies explanation. And whatever it was, I think it's still out there, watching and waiting. I've tried talking to my superiors, but they shut me down immediately. "Let it go, Thompson," they say. "You're just shaken up from your first body. It'll pass." But it hasn't passed. If anything, the feeling that I'm in danger, that we're all in danger, has only grown stronger. I catch glimpses sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, of a figure standing at the edge of the forest. But when I turn to look, it's gone. I've started keeping a journal, documenting everything strange that happens. The voices in the woods, the impossible decomposition of Natalie's body, the way the entire forest fell silent that day, as if holding its breath. I know I sound paranoid. Hell, maybe I am. But I can't shake the feeling that we're missing something huge here, that there's a truth hidden in those woods, that someone, or something, doesn't want us to uncover. I've been spending my off hours combing through old newspaper archives, looking for any similar incidents in the area. And what I've found is chilling. Over the past 50 years, there have been dozens of disappearances in and around Wayne National Forest. Hikers, campers, even a few locals. All vanished without a trace. Most were written off as accidents or runaways. A few bodies were found, always in advanced stages of decay, regardless of how long they'd been missing. But the majority were never seen again. What's happening in these woods? Why is no one talking about it? And why do I feel like I'm being silenced every time I try to dig deeper? I can't sleep anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I see Natalie's skeletal face grinning at me from the forest floor. I hear my own voice echoing through the trees, calling out to someone or something that isn't there. I'm writing this all down because I'm afraid. Afraid that I might be next. Afraid that whatever happened to Natalie and all those others might be coming for me. If anything happens to me, I want there to be a record. I want someone to know the truth. To whoever's reading this, be careful. There's something in those woods, something ancient and hungry. It's been there for a long time, and I don't think it's going anywhere. Watch the shadows, listen for the voices, and whatever you do, don't go into the forest alone. I don't know how much longer I can stay in Rondeville. The weight of what I've seen, what I know, is crushing me. But I can't leave, not until I find out what really happened to Natalie Briarwood and all the others who vanished in these woods. So I'll keep digging, keep searching for answers, even if it costs me everything. Because someone has to uncover the truth. Someone has to stop whatever's hiding in Wayne National Forest before it claims another victim. If you're reading this and I've gone missing, don't believe what they tell you. Don't let them brush it under the rug like all the others. Keep asking questions. Keep pushing for answers, because the truth is out there, hidden in the shadows of the forest, and it's more terrifying than anything we could have imagined. I never believed in curses or supernatural stuff, but after what happened to me last weekend, I'm not so sure anymore. It all started when I decided to go camping in the Shawnee National Forest. I'd heard rumors about strange disappearances in those woods over the years, but I figured they were just urban legends to scare tourists. Man, was I wrong. I set up my tent near a creek on Friday afternoon, planning to spend a couple days hiking and fishing. As I was gathering firewood that evening, I ran into this old Native American guy who introduced himself as Mr. Shanta. He seemed friendly enough at first, asking if I was camping alone and how long I planned to stay. But then his expression turned grave, and he started telling me about some ancient tribal legend. According to Mr. Shanta, 500 years ago, a star fell from the sky and caused a massive forest fire that wiped out all animal life in the area. Only the trees survived. He said the forest spirits offered to protect the Shawnee people, but demanded a terrible price: human sacrifice, one person per generation. When the tribal chief refused, half the tribe vanished without a trace overnight. I tried to laugh it off, but Mr. Shanta was dead serious. He claimed the forest was inhabited by demonic entities that fed on human sacrifices. To back up his story, he pulled out a folder full of old newspaper clippings documenting periodic disappearances in the region every 30-40 years. The dates lined up eerily well with his tale about the forest choosing its victims. I'll admit, I got a little spooked. But I chalked it up to an old man's imagination and some coincidental missing persons cases. I thanked Mr. Shanta for the interesting story and headed back to my campsite as the sun started to set. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No crickets chirping, no owls hooting, just dead silence. Around 2 a.m. I was jolted awake by what sounded like whispers coming from just outside my tent. I figured it was the wind in the trees, but when I peeked outside, the air was completely still. I tried to go back to sleep, but the whispers kept getting louder. They almost sounded like words in some language I couldn't understand. My heart was pounding as I zipped up my sleeping bag and told myself I was just letting that stupid legend get to me. Suddenly, my whole tent started shaking violently. I scrambled to unzip the door, thinking it must be a bear or something. But when I looked outside, there was nothing there. The shaking stopped as abruptly as it started. That's when I noticed the smell, like rotting meat mixed with sulfur. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area around my tent, but didn't see anything out of place. As I turned to go back inside, the beam of my light caught something that made my blood run cold. Footprints, dozens of them, circling my tent. But these weren't animal tracks or human footprints. They looked almost like handprints, but with long, twisted fingers ending in claws, and they were seared into the ground like they'd been burned there. I started throwing my gear into my backpack, planning to hightail it out of there. But as soon as I stepped out of the tent, the whispering started up again, louder this time, and coming from all directions. I spun around, trying to pinpoint the source, but it seemed to be coming from the trees themselves. That's when I saw them. Dark, twisted shapes moving in the shadows between the trees. They were vaguely humanoid, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. And their eyes, God, their eyes glowed red in the darkness. I took off running, not even bothering to grab the rest of my gear. I could hear them pursuing me, branches snapping as they moved through the forest with inhuman speed. The whispers grew to a deafening roar, and I felt claws raking across my back as I sprinted through the underbrush. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours. My lungs were burning and my legs were ready to give out, but sheer terror kept me going. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I burst out of the tree line onto the main road. As soon as my feet hit the pavement, everything went quiet. The whispers stopped, and when I looked back, the forest was still. No sign of my pursuers. I flagged down a passing car and got the hell out of there. I've been trying to rationalize what happened ever since. Maybe I ate some bad mushrooms, or the isolation got to me and I had some kind of mental break. But I can't explain away the claw marks on my back or the burns on my feet that match the handprint-like tracks I saw. I did some research when I got home and found more newspaper articles about disappearances in that forest going back over 100 years. Always following the same pattern. One person every few decades, usually a lone hiker or camper. I don't know if I believe in curses or demons, but something evil lives in those woods. Maybe the legend Mr. Shanta told me was true, and the forest really does demand sacrifices. All I know is I'll never set foot in the Shawnee National Forest again. And if you value your life, neither should you. I'm still trying to process everything that happened that night. The memory of those glowing red eyes still haunts my dreams. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear those otherworldly whispers again. The rational part of my brain keeps trying to come up with logical explanations. Maybe I stumbled into some kind of illegal drug operation in the woods, and the demons were just people in costumes trying to scare me off. Or perhaps there were hallucinogenic spores in the air that caused me to have vivid hallucinations. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. The pure malevolence I felt emanating from those creatures wasn't something that could be faked or imagined. And the physical evidence, the claw marks, the burns, proves it wasn't all in my head. I've become a bit obsessed with researching the history of the area since my experience. I've found records of similar encounters going back centuries. Native American oral histories speak of shadow people who stalk the forests at night. Early pioneer journals mention hearing strange whispers and seeing red eyes gleaming in the darkness. One article from 1923 describes a group of campers who fled the forest in terror, babbling about demons made of smoke and darkness. They were dismissed as suffering from mass hysteria at the time. But now I wonder if they encountered the same entities I did. I've tried reaching out to Mr. Shanta to learn more about the legend he told me, but it's like he vanished into thin air. None of the local Shawnee I've spoken to seem to know who he is. Part of me wonders if he was even human, or if he was some kind of spirit guide trying to warn me. The more I dig into the history of the Shawnee National Forest, the more convinced I become that there's something ancient and evil dwelling there. Those periodic disappearances aren't random. They follow a clear pattern, like clockwork every few decades. It's as if the forest is collecting its due, just like in the legend. I've started having nightmares where I'm back in those woods, running from the shadows. But in the dreams, I can never escape. The whispers get louder and louder until they're screaming in my head. Twisted hands reach for me from the darkness. I always wake up just as they're about to grab me, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. Sometimes I catch myself staring at the tree line in the distance, half expecting to see those glowing red eyes staring back at me. I know it's irrational, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever's in that forest isn't confined to its borders. Like it's aware of me, watching me, waiting for a chance to finish what it started. I don't know if sharing my story will help keep others safe, or if it will just make me sound crazy. But I feel like I have to warn people. That forest is hungry, and it's patient. It can wait decades between meals if it has to. So if you're planning a camping trip in southern Illinois, do yourself a favor and pick another spot. Because if you venture into the Shawnee National Forest, you might just become its next sacrifice. And trust me, there are far worse fates than simply disappearing without a trace. I got lucky. I escaped with my life and my sanity mostly intact. The next victim might not be so fortunate. I still have so many unanswered questions. What exactly are those creatures? Are they really demons or something even stranger? How long have they been there? And most importantly, why do they need human sacrifices? Part of me wants to go back, to try to uncover the truth once and for all. But the memory of that night is enough to keep me far away. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. All I know is that I'll never look at forests the same way again. Because now I know that sometimes the monsters hiding in the shadows are all too real. I was so excited when I got the job as a fire lookout at Sentinel Peak. The idea of spending a summer alone in the wilderness, keeping watch over the forest, it sounded like the perfect escape. I'd always been a bit of a loner, so the solitude didn't bother me. If anything, I was looking forward to it. The ranger who drove me up to the tower seemed nice enough. He went over the basic procedures, showed me how to use the radio, and pointed out landmarks I should keep an eye on. Before he left, he handed me a thick binder full of protocols and said, "Just follow the manual and you'll be fine, kid." With a wave, he hopped in his truck and disappeared down the winding mountain road, leaving me truly alone for the first time. Those first few days were pretty uneventful. I settled into a routine of scanning the horizon with binoculars, logging my observations, and exploring the immediate area around the tower. The solitude was peaceful at first. I'd watch spectacular sunsets from the catwalk, marveling at how the fading light painted the distant peaks in shades of gold and purple. But as the days went on, I started to notice little things that seemed off. It was hard to put my finger on at first, just a general sense of unease that I couldn't quite shake. It started with the supply drops. According to the manual, I was supposed to get weekly deliveries of food and other necessities, but they never came on a consistent schedule. Sometimes it would be every few days, other times over a week would pass with nothing. And the strangest part was, I never saw or heard any vehicles or aircraft making the deliveries. The supplies would just appear on the ground near the base of the tower when I wasn't looking. Then there was the sister station. The manual mentioned another lookout tower about 10 miles to the north that I was supposed to check in with daily. But every time I tried to radio them, all I got was static. I mentioned it to my supervisor on my weekly check-in, but he just brushed it off, saying there must be some interference in the mountains. As the weeks wore on, my unease grew into a gnawing anxiety. I started having trouble sleeping, constantly waking up in the middle of the night, convinced I'd heard footsteps on the metal stairs leading up to my cabin. But when I'd go to check, there was never anyone there. One morning, about a month into my stay, I woke up to find fresh boot prints in the dirt around the base of the tower. They definitely weren't mine. They were much larger, and the tread pattern was different. I radioed it in, but again, my supervisor didn't seem concerned. He suggested it was probably just a hiker passing through, even though the tower was miles from any marked trails. That's when I started seeing the hunter. At first it was just glimpses, a figure moving between distant trees, gone as soon as I tried to focus on it. But over time, the sightings became more frequent and closer to the tower. He was always dressed the same, heavy canvas jacket, wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes, and he always carried a rifle. I tried to rationalize it. Hunting wasn't allowed in this part of the forest, but maybe he was just some local who didn't care about the rules. Still, something about him filled me with dread. The way he moved wasn't quite natural, and he never responded when I called out to him. Things came to a head about 2 months in. I woke up one morning to find all my food supplies gone. The cabinets were completely bare. In a panic, I radioed for an emergency resupply. My supervisor said they'd send someone right away, but hours passed with no sign of help. As the sun began to set, I spotted movement at the tree line. It was the hunter, slowly advancing towards the tower. For the first time, I got a clear look at his face. What I saw made my blood run cold. His features were blurred, like a photograph that had been smeared, and his eyes, they were just empty black voids. I slammed the shutters closed and barricaded myself in the cabin, my heart pounding. All night long I heard him circling the tower, testing the doors, scratching at the walls. When dawn finally broke, he was gone. That's when I found the VHS tape. It was hidden in a locked compartment of the supply cabinet that I'd never noticed before. With shaking hands, I put it in the ancient VCR hooked up to the tiny TV in the corner. The video showed a man, another fire lookout by the looks of his uniform. He was clearly terrified, his eyes wild as he spoke directly to the camera. "If you're watching this, you're trapped just like I am. This isn't a normal fire lookout station. It's some kind of experiment. I've been here for months, maybe years. Time doesn't work right here. I've tried to leave, but I always end up back at the tower. The hunter, he's not human. He's part of it somehow. You have to burn it all down. It's the only way to break the loop." The video cut off abruptly. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what I'd just seen. It was insane, impossible, and yet it explained so much. I spent the next few days in a daze, poring over every inch of the tower, looking for more clues. I found other hidden compartments, filled with journals and notes from previous lookouts. They all told similar stories: time loops, the mysterious hunter, failed escape attempts. I knew what I had to do. I gathered every flammable item I could find and piled them at the base of the tower. As I was about to strike the match, I heard a twig snap behind me. I whirled around to find the hunter standing there, rifle raised. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then, moving faster than should have been possible, he lunged at me. We grappled on the ground, rolling dangerously close to the edge of the cliff. In desperation, I managed to get my hands on a rock and brought it down hard on his head. There was a sickening crunch, and he went limp. Panting, I scrambled to my feet and stumbled back to the tower. With trembling hands, I lit the match and tossed it onto the pile of fuel. The flames caught quickly, racing up the wooden supports. As the tower burned, I heard the distant thrum of helicopter blades. A spotlight cut through the smoke, illuminating me where I stood. A voice boomed from a loudspeaker. "Subject 13, stand down. The experiment is over." Men in military uniforms rappelled down from the chopper, quickly surrounding me. As they led me away, I caught a glimpse of the hunter's body. To my horror, it was dissolving, melting away like a special effect in a movie. They took me to some kind of underground facility. For days, I was debriefed by stern-faced officials who refused to give me straight answers about what had happened. They kept calling it an temporal isolation study and referring to me as Subject 13. Finally, a man in a lab coat sat down across from me. "Congratulations," he said with a thin smile. "You're the first subject to successfully complete the scenario. Your actions in burning the tower were unexpected but effective. We'd like to offer you the chance to participate in our next phase of testing. The pay is excellent, and you've already proven yourself capable." I stared at him in disbelief. "You want me to go back, after everything that happened?" He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity. "Think about it. Did you really escape? Or are you still part of the experiment, just on a larger scale?" I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized he might be right. The facility, the debriefings, it all felt just a little too perfect, too scripted. What if this was just another level of the scenario? In the end, I agreed to go back. Not because I wanted to, but because I realized I might not have a choice. If I was still trapped, maybe playing along was the only way to finally break free. As I write this now, I'm back in a fire lookout tower. It looks just like Sentinel Peak, but they assure me it's a different location. New rules, they said, new variables to test. But I can't shake the feeling that I never really left, that I'm still caught in the loop, doomed to relive this nightmare over and over again. And sometimes, when I scan the tree line with my binoculars, I swear I can see a familiar figure in a wide-brimmed hat watching me from the shadows. I never thought working at a supermarket could be so terrifying. It was my first day on the job at SuperSave, a bustling store right off the highway exit. I was excited to start earning some money, but nothing could have prepared me for the chaos that unfolded during the dreaded rush hour. The day started off normally enough. I arrived for my 2 p.m. shift, put on my bright blue uniform vest, and got oriented to my duties as a stock clerk. The store manager, a gruff middle-aged guy named Bob, gave me a quick rundown. Stock shelves, help customers find items, keep the aisles tidy. Oh, and watch out for the rush between 4 and 6. It gets pretty crazy in here. I nodded, thinking he just meant it would be busy. If only I knew what was really coming. For the first couple hours, things were calm. I restocked cereal boxes, helped an old lady find the canned peaches, and chatted with some of my new coworkers. Around 3:30, I noticed more cars pulling into the parking lot. By 3:45, the store was getting crowded. At 4 p.m. sharp, it was like someone flipped a switch. Suddenly, the doors were bursting open and a flood of people poured in. Within minutes, the aisles were packed. Shopping carts collided as people fought to grab items off the shelves. The noise level rose to a dull roar. I tried to continue stocking items, but it was nearly impossible to move. Shoppers kept bumping into me, knocking boxes out of my arms. One lady practically dove across me to snatch the last box of crackers off the shelf. "Excuse me, where are the—" a customer started to ask, but was cut off as someone else shoved past. The produce section looked like a war zone, with apples and oranges rolling across the floor. I saw a kid slip on a smooshed banana and go down hard. I made my way to the front to see if I could help bag groceries, but the checkout lines stretched all the way to the back of the store. Every single register was open, with cashiers frantically scanning items. Suddenly, I felt something hit my foot. I looked down to see a jar of pasta sauce shattered on the floor, red sauce splattered everywhere. Before I could even think about cleaning it up, 3 more people slipped in the mess and went down. "Someone get a mop," I yelled, but my voice was drowned out by the cacophony of voices and beeping registers. I tried to make my way to the break room to catch my breath, but it was like swimming upstream. The crowd kept pushing me back, jostling me from all sides. I started to feel claustrophobic and panicky. Just then, I locked eyes with Maria, one of the more experienced cashiers. She must have sensed my distress, because she motioned for me to come over. "First day, huh?" she said sympathetically when I finally reached her register. "Rush hour's a bitch. Listen, there are 4 rules you gotta remember if you want to survive here." She held up one finger. "First, stay out of the aisles during peak hours. It's not safe out there." A second finger went up. "Keep all registers open no matter what. Even if someone needs a break, they wait till after 6. Third," she continued, "don't engage with customers more than absolutely necessary. They're like sharks in a feeding frenzy. Show any weakness and they'll eat you alive. And finally," she said, raising a 4th finger, "stay hydrated. It's hot as hell in here with all these bodies." I nodded gratefully, trying to take it all in. Just then, Bob the manager appeared behind me. "What are you doing standing around?" he barked. "Get back out there and help customers." "But it's chaos out there," I protested. "Someone could get hurt. Maybe we should limit how many people can come in." Bob scoffed. "Are you kidding? This is our busiest time. Now get moving before I write you up." Reluctantly, I waded back into the sea of shoppers. For the next 2 hours, it was non-stop insanity. I got elbowed, stepped on, and yelled at more times than I could count. The heat was stifling, and sweat poured down my face. I saw things I'll never forget. A woman climbing the shelves like a monkey to reach the last box of her favorite cereal. 2 men getting into a fist fight over the last rotisserie chicken. An entire display of paper towels collapsing and burying several customers. At one point, I swear I saw someone crawling on their hands and knees, weaving between people's legs to snatch items off the bottom shelves. The desperate look in their eyes haunts me to this day. The worst part was when the power flickered. For a split second, the entire store went dark. The collective gasp from hundreds of people was chilling. When the lights came back on, it was like everyone had moved a few feet from where they were before. Items had vanished off shelves. I still can't explain it. As 6 p.m. approached, I kept glancing desperately at the clock. The crowd showed no signs of thinning. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. 5:55 p.m. I was trapped in the dairy section, pinned against the refrigerator cases. People were grabbing milk and eggs over my head. I couldn't breathe. 5:57 p.m. A fight broke out by the deli counter. I heard screaming and the sound of glass breaking. 5:59 p.m. The noise reached a fever pitch. The floor was vibrating. I squeezed my eyes shut and prayed for it to be over. 6:00 p.m. Like magic, a hush fell over the store. I opened my eyes to see the crowd thinning out, customers calmly making their way to the exits. Within minutes, the aisles were clear. It was as if nothing had happened. I stood there in shock, surrounded by the aftermath. Fallen items littered the floor. Shelves were in disarray. A few shell-shocked employees emerged from various hiding spots around the store. Bob appeared, looking annoyingly chipper. "Great job, team. Same time tomorrow." I wanted to quit on the spot, but I was too exhausted to form words. I stumbled to the break room in a daze, collapsing into a chair. Maria came in a few minutes later and handed me a bottle of water. "You made it," she said with a tired smile. "First rush hour is always the hardest. It gets easier." I took a long drink, my hands still shaking. "Does it always get that crazy?" I asked. She nodded grimly. "Every day like clockwork. You learn to prepare for it, but you never really get used to it." As I drove home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. How could things get so out of control, day after day, with no consequences? Why did management allow it to happen? And most disturbing of all, would I be able to face it again tomorrow? I've been working at Super Save for a few months now. The rush hours are still intense, but I've learned to navigate them better. I follow Maria's rules religiously, but there are still unexplained things that happen during those chaotic 2 hours. Items that seem to move on their own, glimpses of impossible things in my peripheral vision, the unsettling way time seems to stretch and warp. Sometimes I wonder if there's more going on than just crowds and consumerism. But then I remind myself, it's just a supermarket, right? It all started when I got a call from my manager asking if I could cover the overnight shift. Apparently Claire, who usually worked nights, had been in some kind of accident and was in the hospital. I needed the extra money, so I agreed, even though I'd never worked that late before. When I arrived for my shift, the store was eerily quiet. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I made my way to the back office. My manager was there waiting for me with a grim expression. "Listen carefully," he said, handing me a folded piece of paper. "These are the rules for the night shift. Follow them exactly, and you'll be fine." I unfolded the paper, expecting to see the usual stuff about restocking and cleaning. Instead, there was a numbered list of 6 very strange rules. 1. Never leave the cash register area between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. 2. Keep the storage room door locked at all times. 3. If you hear crying, do not investigate. 4. When Barbara comes in, let her take any expired products she wants. 5. If you see a man in a blue hat, do not make eye contact. 6. At exactly 3:33 a.m., turn off all the lights for 60 seconds. I looked up at my manager in confusion. "What is all this? Is this some kind of joke?" He shook his head gravely. "Just follow the rules and you'll be fine. Good luck." And with that, he left me alone in the store. For the first couple hours, things were pretty normal. I restocked some shelves, did some cleaning, helped the occasional late-night customer. But as it got closer to 1 a.m., I started to feel on edge. The store seemed to get quieter and quieter until all I could hear was the low hum of the refrigerators. At 1 a.m. sharp, I positioned myself behind the register like the rules said. Almost immediately, I started hearing strange noises coming from the back of the store, scraping sounds like something heavy being dragged across the floor, muffled thumps and bangs. A few times I thought I heard whispering, but when I strained to listen closer, it faded away. I kept glancing nervously at the clock, willing it to move faster. The sounds continued on and off, sometimes stopping for long stretches before starting up again suddenly. My heart was racing the whole time. Around 2:30 a.m., the bell over the door chimed. I looked up to see an elderly woman shuffling in. She was hunched over and moving slowly, and as she got closer, I realized with a jolt that where her face should have been was just blank skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth flesh. I was frozen in terror as she made her way through the store, picking up expired milk and moldy produce and putting them in her cart. When she was done, she came up to my register. I couldn't speak, could barely breathe. She simply stood there for a long moment before turning and walking out, expired groceries in tow. As soon as she was gone, I scrambled for the list of rules. When Barbara comes in, let her take any expired products she wants. My hands were shaking as I realized this must have been Barbara. I felt sick to my stomach. The next hour crawled by agonizingly slowly. Every little noise made me jump. I kept picturing Barbara's blank face and shuddering. At 3:30 a.m., I heard what sounded like someone crying. It was coming from the back of the store, by the dairy section. My first instinct was to go check it out, but then I remembered rule number 3, do not investigate crying. So I stayed put, my whole body tense as the sobbing continued. At exactly 3:33 a.m., I flipped off all the lights like the rules said. Standing there in the pitch black, I could still hear the crying. It seemed to be getting closer. My breath caught in my throat as I heard shuffling footsteps approaching. After what felt like an eternity, the 60 seconds were up, and I turned the lights back on. There was no sign of anyone, but the crying had stopped. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm my racing heart. Just when I thought the night couldn't get any worse, a man came bursting through the door around 4 a.m. He looked disheveled and agitated, pacing back and forth in front of my register. "Where is she?" he demanded. "Where's Claire? She's supposed to be here." I tried to explain that Claire wasn't working, that I was covering her shift, but he didn't seem to hear me. He got more and more worked up, shouting and slamming his fists on the counter. I was terrified he was going to attack me. Just as he lunged towards me, my manager appeared out of nowhere. He put his hand on the man's shoulder and said something I couldn't hear. Instantly, the man went slack and walked out of the store like nothing had happened. I turned to my manager, a million questions on the tip of my tongue, but he just gave me a stern look and said, "Remember the rules." Then he vanished into the back room. The rest of my shift passed in a daze. When 6 a.m. finally rolled around and the morning crew started arriving, I practically ran out of there. I called in sick for my next few shifts, unable to face going back. It's been a week now, and I still can't explain what happened that night. Was it all some elaborate prank? A hallucination from sleep deprivation? Or something truly supernatural? All I know is I'll never look at grocery stores the same way again. And I sure as hell am never working another night shift. Some rules aren't meant to be broken. It was a scorcher of a day when my cousin Ross came hollerin' up to my cabin. I was out back, tending to my stockpile like I always do. Gotta be prepared, you know. World's a dangerous place, and a man's gotta look out for himself. "Eli!" Ross shouted, nearly out of breath. "You ain't gonna believe what I saw down by the creek." I barely looked up from my work. Ross was always going on about something or other. "What's got you all riled up this time?" It was him, Eli, the Sasquatch, big as life, standing right there in the water. Now, I'd heard tales about the Sasquatch all my life. Hell, I'd even caught glimpses of something strange in the woods from time to time, but I never put much stock in it. Figured it was just talk, you know. But the look in Ross's eyes, well, it made me wonder. You sure about that? I asked, finally giving him my full attention. Ross nodded so hard I thought his head might come clean off. Swear on Mama's grave, Eli, it was real as you and me. I chewed on that for a minute. If Ross was right, if there really was a Sasquatch roaming these parts, well, that could change everything. The money, the fame, hell, we'd be set for life. All right, I said finally. Show me where you saw it. We set off into the woods, Ross leading the way. As we walked, I couldn't help but think about all the years I'd spent up here, preparing for God knows what. My cabin was a fortress, stocked with enough supplies to last through any disaster. But this could be my ticket out. The creek was cool and clear when we reached it. Ross pointed to a spot on the far bank. Right there, Eli. It was standing right there, big as a house. I studied the area, looking for any sign of the creature. There were some tracks in the mud, bigger than any I'd ever seen. And the trees, some of the branches were broken off real high up, like something massive had pushed through. Well, I'll be damned, I muttered. You might be onto something here, Ross. We spent the rest of the day searching the area, but we didn't find nothing else. As the sun started to set, we headed back to my cabin. I could see the wheels turning in Ross's head. We gotta catch it, Eli, he said as we walked. Think of what it'd mean. I nodded, my mind already racing with possibilities. We'll need supplies, traps, guns, just in case. Ross grinned. I knew you'd be on board. We're gonna be famous, cuz. Famous, rich, respected. All the things I'd never been. It was tempting, I'll admit. But something in my gut told me we were messing with forces we didn't understand. We spent the next few days preparing. I dug into my stockpile, pulling out every trap and weapon I thought might be useful. Ross spread the word to a few trusted friends, and before long, we had ourselves a regular hunting party. The night of the hunt, we gathered at my cabin. The air was thick with excitement and fear. I looked at the faces around me, Ross grinning like a fool, Tom, the local sheriff, trying to look brave, and a couple of Ross's buddies from town, wide-eyed and nervous. All right, listen up, I said, my voice low. We don't know what we're dealing with here. Stay alert, stay together, and for God's sake, be careful. We set out just as the sun was setting, the woods growing dark and strange around us. I led the way, my old rifle clutched tight in my hands. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes had us jumping. Hours passed and we saw nothing. The others were getting restless, starting to doubt. But I knew these woods better than anyone, and something felt off. The air was too still, the animals too quiet. It was near midnight when we heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. We all froze, our hearts pounding. What the hell was that? Tom whispered, his hand shaking on his gun. Before anyone could answer, there was a crash in the underbrush. Something big was moving towards us fast. Spread out, I yelled, but it was too late. It burst into the clearing like a freight train, 8 feet tall, covered in thick, dark fur. Its eyes glowed in the moonlight, fixed right on us. For a moment, nobody moved. We just stared, unable to believe what we were seeing. Then all hell broke loose. Guns went off. People were yelling. I raised my rifle, but I couldn't seem to pull the trigger. The creature, the Sasquatch, it looked almost human. There was intelligence in those eyes, and something else, fear. It let out a roar that shook the trees, then turned and ran. Without thinking, I took off after it. I could hear the others shouting behind me, but I didn't stop. I chased it through the woods, ducking under branches and leaping over fallen logs. My lungs were burning, but I couldn't stop. I had to know. Finally, I burst into another clearing. The Sasquatch was there, standing in the moonlight, but it wasn't alone. There were others, smaller ones, hiding behind the trees. A family. They were scared, huddled together, watching me with those two human eyes. In that moment, everything changed. All my plans, all my dreams of fame and fortune. They didn't matter anymore. I lowered my gun, my hands shaking. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I don't know if they understood. "I'm so sorry." The big one, the one we'd been chasing, stepped forward. For a second, I thought it was going to attack, but instead, it just looked at me, and in its eyes, I saw something I never expected. Forgiveness. Then, as quick as they'd appeared, they were gone, vanished into the woods like they'd never been there at all. I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. When the others finally caught up, I told them the creature had gotten away. They were disappointed, but I could see the relief on their faces too. We headed back to my cabin in silence. As we walked, I made a decision. I wasn't going to tell anyone what I'd seen. Some things, I realized, are meant to stay secret. That was years ago now. I still live up in these mountains, still keep my cabin stocked and ready. But I do it for different reasons now, not out of fear, but out of respect. Respect for the woods and for the creatures that call it home. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think I can hear them out there. A family, living their lives just like us. And I smile, knowing that I helped keep their secrets safe. It's a heavy thing, carrying a truth like that. But I reckon it's my burden to bear. And every day, I'm grateful for the lesson those creatures taught me. That sometimes the greatest adventure isn't in capturing something wild, but in letting it be free. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this. As an animal removal specialist in Atlanta, I've dealt with my fair share of weird and wild encounters, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened last week. It started off as just another job. A guy called saying he needed help with some kind of large animal on his property up in the North Georgia mountains. He was offering way more money than my usual rate, which should have been my first red flag. But I'll admit, the promise of a big payday clouded my judgment. I loaded up my truck early Thursday morning and made the drive up into the mountains. The address I was given led me down a winding dirt road deep into the woods. When I finally arrived at the property, I was greeted by an older man who introduced himself as Earl. "Thanks for coming out here, son," he said, his voice gruff. "Got ourselves a real problem and could use a professional." I nodded, trying to look confident despite the unease I was starting to feel. "No problem. What kind of animal are we dealing with here?" Earl hesitated, glancing towards the dense forest behind his cabin. "Well, that's the thing. I'm not entirely sure. It's big, though, real big, and it's been killing my livestock." I frowned. "Like a bear, maybe?" "Nah, bigger than a bear, and it walks on two legs." My stomach dropped. Was this guy for real? I almost turned around and left right then, but the promise of that payout kept me there. "All right," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why don't you show me where you've seen signs of it?" Earl led me into the woods behind his property. As we walked, he told me about the strange noises he'd been hearing at night, the way his dogs refused to go outside anymore, and the mangled carcasses of his goats he'd found. We'd been hiking for about 20 minutes when Earl suddenly stopped short. "There," he whispered, pointing to something on the ground. I looked where he was indicating and felt my blood run cold. There in the soft earth was a massive footprint, easily twice the size of my own foot. But it wasn't the size that disturbed me most, it was the shape. The print looked almost human, but distorted somehow. "What the hell?" I muttered, crouching down to examine it closer. "Told you it was big," Earl said. "You ever seen anything like that before?" I shook my head, unable to speak. My mind was racing, trying to come up with any rational explanation for what I was seeing. But deep down, I knew we were dealing with something far beyond my expertise. We continued on, following a trail of broken branches and more of those unnerving footprints. The further we went, the more on edge I felt. The forest seemed to grow darker and quieter around us, as if holding its breath. Suddenly, a piercing shriek echoed through the trees, causing both Earl and I to jump. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite human, not quite animal. The sound made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "That's it," Earl whispered, his face pale. "That's the sound I've been hearing." I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to run. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. But Earl shook his head. "No, we're close now. I can feel it." Against my better judgment, I followed him deeper into the woods. The light was growing dim as evening approached, casting long shadows between the trees. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves had me whipping my head around, searching for the source. We came to a small clearing, and Earl motioned for me to stop. That's when I saw it, a dark shape moving at the edge of the trees. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with long arms that nearly touched the ground. I couldn't make out any details in the fading light, but I knew instantly that this was no ordinary animal. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there frozen in terror. But I couldn't move a muscle. The creature turned its head towards us, and I saw 2 glowing eyes reflect in the darkness. A low growl rumbled through the clearing, so deep I could feel it in my bones. That's when Earl did something I'll never understand. He started walking towards it. "Earl, no!" I hissed, but he ignored me. The creature let out another of those bone-chilling shrieks and charged. It happened so fast I could barely process what I was seeing. One moment Earl was there, and the next he was gone, snatched up by those impossibly long arms. I don't remember deciding to run. One second I was standing there in shock, and the next I was tearing through the forest as fast as my legs could carry me. Branches whipped at my face and I tripped more than once, but pure adrenaline kept me going. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush. That awful shriek split the air again, closer this time. I ran harder than I've ever run in my life, my lungs burning and my legs aching. Just when I thought my heart might give out, I burst out of the tree line and saw Earl's cabin ahead. I sprinted for my truck, fumbling with the keys as I reached it. As I threw the door open and jumped inside, I caught a glimpse of something huge and dark emerging from the woods. I peeled out of there, tires spinning in the dirt. In my rearview mirror, I saw a massive shape loping after the truck. But as I hit the main road and picked up speed, it fell behind and disappeared into the gathering darkness. I didn't stop driving until I was back in Atlanta, my hands shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. I went straight to the police station, babbling about monsters in the woods and a missing man named Earl. They clearly thought I was insane or on drugs. When they finally sent some officers to check out Earl's property the next day, they found nothing. No sign of Earl, no giant footprints, no evidence of any kind of struggle or attack. They wrote it off as a drunk hiker getting lost in the woods. It's been a week now and I still can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see those glowing eyes in the darkness. I hear that inhuman shriek echoing in my dreams. I know what I saw out there, even if no one believes me. Part of me wishes I'd never taken that job, never let greed cloud my judgment. But another part of me, a part I'm not proud of, is almost glad I experienced it. How many people can say they've encountered something truly unexplainable, something that challenges everything they thought they knew about the world? I don't know if I'll ever be able to return to my normal life after what happened. But I do know one thing. I'll never set foot in those mountains again. Whatever's out there, it's best left alone. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some truths are better left unknown. I just hope Earl found that out before it was too late. When I arrived that evening, the old owner Milton gave me a quick tour of the place. It was a small, dimly lit store with shelves of snacks and camping supplies. The flickering fluorescent lights cast an eerie glow over everything. As Milton was showing me how to work the register, I noticed a worn red notebook on the counter. "What's this?" I asked, reaching for it. Milton's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. "That there's the instruction manual," he said gruffly. "Read it carefully and follow every word. Your life may depend on it." I laughed nervously, thinking he was joking, but the deadly serious look in his eyes made my smile fade. He let go of my wrist and shuffled towards the door. "Remember Cooper," he said over his shoulder. "No red clothing, and keep an eye on the campers." With that cryptic warning, he was gone. Alone in the store, I hesitantly opened the notebook. Inside were pages of handwritten instructions, some crossed out or amended. My eyes widened as I read, "If you see the observer, do not make eye contact. Turn off all lights immediately. Beware campers wearing red. They are not what they seem. If tic-tac appears, prepare for danger." What the hell kind of place was this? I tried to convince myself it was just some prank to scare the new guy. But as the night wore on, a growing sense of unease settled over me. Around midnight, a battered pickup truck pulled into the lot. An older man in flannel and a trucker cap came in to buy cigarettes and beef jerky. As I rang him up, I noticed his hands were stained with what looked like red paint. "Quite a night out there," he said casually. "Sky's turning an odd color." I glanced out the window. The night sky had taken on a deep purple hue, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered another note from the book. "Purple sky. Evacuation imminent. Get to the safe room." Before I could respond, there was a loud caw from outside. A large black crow had landed on the roof of the truck, its beady eyes fixed on me through the window. Tic-tac. The man frowned. "Damn bird. Been following me for miles." He grabbed his purchases and hurried out. As soon as he left, I frantically flipped through the notebook. There had to be instructions on what to do next. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely turn the pages. Suddenly, all the lights in the store flickered and went out. In the silence that followed, I heard a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere in the darkness outside. Heart pounding, I fumbled for the flashlight Milton had left me. As the beam cut through the gloom, I saw movement outside the big front windows. Something massive was out there, prowling the edges of the light. I aimed the flashlight directly at it and nearly dropped the thing in shock. For just a split second, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a giant, nearly transparent creature. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but impossibly tall and thin. And its eyes, God, those glowing red eyes boring into me. As quickly as it appeared, it vanished back into the shadows with inhuman speed. I stood there frozen, desperately trying to process what I'd just seen. This couldn't be real. I had to be hallucinating or something. A sharp rap on the window made me yelp in surprise. It was a hiker, a young guy who looked as freaked out as I felt. "Please, you gotta let me in," he yelled through the glass. "There's something out here." Every instinct told me not to open that door, but I couldn't just leave the poor guy out there. Taking a deep breath, I quickly unlocked it, and the hiker burst inside. "Thanks, man," he panted. "I don't know what the hell is going on out there, but it ain't natural." As he caught his breath, I studied him warily. He seemed normal enough. Jeans, hiking boots, green jacket. No red clothing, thankfully. "I'm Samuel," he said, extending his hand. "I was camping up in the hills when the sky turned all weird. Then I started hearing these noises, like nothing I've ever heard before. So I hightailed it out of there." I introduced myself and gave him a brief rundown of the strange events of the night. To my relief, Samuel didn't seem to think I was crazy. He'd seen some unexplainable things out in the forest, too. As we talked, I noticed the sky outside growing even darker, if that was possible. The purple had deepened to an inky black that seemed to absorb all light. An overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. "We need to get to the safe room," I said, grabbing the red notebook. "Follow me." I led Samuel to the back of the store, where a heavy metal door was hidden behind some shelving. It took both of us to heave it open, revealing a small concrete room lined with supplies. No sooner had we entered than a bone-chilling shriek pierced the air. It sounded like it came from just outside the store. Samuel and I exchanged terrified looks as I slammed the door shut. For what felt like hours, we huddled in that cramped room, jumping at every little sound. The walls seemed to vibrate with an otherworldly energy. At one point, I swore I heard Milton's voice calling my name, but when I cracked the door to look, there was only darkness. Just when I thought I couldn't take the suspense anymore, everything went quiet. The oppressive atmosphere lifted like a storm passing. Cautiously, we emerged from the safe room. The store looked like a tornado had hit it. Shelves were overturned, merchandise scattered everywhere. But strangest of all, everything red, from ketchup bottles to candy wrappers, had vanished without a trace. As the sun began to rise, Samuel thanked me profusely and set off towards town. I stayed behind to try to clean up the mess, my mind reeling. Around 8 a.m., Milton's beat-up station wagon pulled into the lot. He looked haggard, with dark circles under his eyes. "You did good, kid," he said gruffly. "Kept your head when it mattered." I had about 1,000,000 questions, but Milton waved them off. "There's forces at work here beyond your understanding. Best not to dwell on it. You did your job. That's what counts." He must have seen the uncertainty on my face because his expression softened slightly. "Look, Cooper, I know this is a lot to take in. Truth is, I'm getting too old for this. Been looking for someone to take over, keep an eye on things. You handled yourself well last night. If you're willing to learn, I'd like you to stay on. Be my apprentice of sorts." I should have run screaming from that place and never looked back. But something made me pause. Maybe it was the earnestness in Milton's eyes, or the realization that whatever was out there in the forest needed to be held at bay. "Okay," I heard myself say. "I'll do it." Milton nodded approvingly. "Good man. Now go get some rest. I have a feeling your nights are about to get a whole lot more interesting." As I drove home that morning, my mind was spinning. I had no idea what I'd just signed up for, or what horrors awaited me in the coming nights at Milton's store. But somehow, I knew my life would never be the same. I've never been so terrified in my life. What happened to me out there in those mountains still haunts me to this day. I keep replaying it over and over, trying to make sense of it, but I just can't. It was supposed to be a simple 2-week solo hiking trip. I'm an experienced outdoorsman, and I've done plenty of solo expeditions before. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on that last night. I had been out in the wilderness for 13 days at that point. My supplies were running low, and I was looking forward to heading back to civilization the next morning. I found a nice spot to set up camp for the night near one of the forest maintenance roads. As I was getting my tent set up, I heard some rustling in the trees nearby. I figured it was probably just a deer or something, so I didn't think much of it at first. But then I heard it again, closer this time, and it didn't sound like any animal I was familiar with. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" but got no response. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild after being alone in the woods for so long. I finished setting up my tent and started a small fire to cook my dinner. As I was eating, I kept glancing nervously into the darkening forest around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After I finished eating, I decided to turn in early. I was exhausted from hiking all day and figured a good night's sleep would help settle my nerves. I put out the fire and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight behind me. I tossed and turned for a while, unable to fall asleep. Every little sound from outside made me flinch. Finally, I managed to drift off into an uneasy sleep. I'm not sure how long I was out before I was jolted awake by a horrific screeching sound right outside my tent. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite human, not quite animal. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I fumbled for my flashlight with shaking hands. As I turned it on, I saw the silhouette of something massive moving outside the thin fabric of my tent. Whatever it was, it had to be at least 15-20 feet tall. I was paralyzed with fear, hardly daring to breathe. The creature circled my tent slowly, making these low rumbling noises that vibrated through my whole body. I could see its shadow through the tent, towering over me. Suddenly, it let out another piercing shriek and slammed into the side of my tent. The whole thing collapsed on top of me. I thrashed around frantically, trying to free myself from the tangled mess of fabric and poles. I finally managed to tear my way out and scrambled to my feet. What I saw when I emerged nearly made my heart stop. Looming over me was the most terrifying thing I've ever laid eyes on. It was enormous, at least 20 feet tall. Its body was semi-transparent, like it was made of some kind of shimmering energy. I could make out a vaguely humanoid shape, with long, gangly limbs and a massive, misshapen head. Where its face should have been was just a gaping black void. As it leaned down towards me, I felt an overwhelming sense of malevolence and hunger emanating from it. I didn't even think, I just ran. I sprinted blindly through the dark forest, branches whipping at my face and roots trying to trip me up. I could hear the creature pursuing me, its footsteps shaking the ground. I had no idea where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get away from that thing. After what felt like hours of running, but was probably only a few minutes, I burst out onto the maintenance road. To my shock and relief, I saw headlights coming down the road towards me. I waved my arms frantically and screamed for help. The truck screeched to a halt, and a man jumped out. "Get in, quick!" he yelled. I didn't need to be told twice. I dove into the passenger seat as the man climbed back behind the wheel. As he floored it, I looked in the side mirror and saw the creature emerging from the tree line behind us. "What the hell is that thing?" I gasped. "Don't look at it," the man snapped. "Just keep your eyes forward." I was shaking uncontrollably. as we sped down the bumpy dirt road. My rescuer introduced himself as Cooper and said he worked at a gas station a few miles down the road. "I've seen that thing before," he said grimly. "It's been stalking these woods for years. We call it the Watcher." Just then, something slammed into the back of the truck with incredible force. The rear windshield shattered. I heard that bone-chilling screech again, much closer this time. Cooper cursed and swerved wildly, nearly running us off the road. I risked a glance behind us and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was right on our tail, moving impossibly fast for something so large. Its void-like face was inches from the back of the truck. "We're not going to make it," I whimpered. "Oh, yes, we are," Cooper growled. He reached over and flipped a switch on the dashboard. Suddenly, insanely bright floodlights mounted on top of the truck blazed to life, illuminating the road ahead and behind us. The creature let out a shriek of pain and fell back, shielding its face. Cooper whooped in triumph. "They don't like the light," he yelled. "We're almost there. Hang on." We careened around a bend in the road, and I saw a brightly lit gas station up ahead. Cooper skidded into the parking lot and slammed on the brakes. "Run inside now," he ordered. We both leapt out of the truck and sprinted for the door of the gas station. I heard that awful screech again and knew the creature was right behind us. We burst through the door and Cooper slammed it shut, throwing the deadbolt. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. Cooper ran to the window and peered out into the darkness. After a few tense moments, he let out a relieved sigh. "I think we lost it," he said. "The lights around the station usually keep it away." As the adrenaline started to wear off, the reality of what had just happened hit me like a ton of bricks. I started sobbing uncontrollably. Cooper came over and put a hand on my shoulder. "It's okay. You're safe now," he said gently. "I know it's a lot to process. Why don't you come sit down and I'll make you some coffee?" I nodded weakly and let him help me to my feet. As we walked towards the little seating area, I noticed a large German shepherd lying in the corner. It raised its head and looked at me with eerily intelligent eyes. "That's Sarge," Cooper said, following my gaze. "He's a good judge of character, and he's got a knack for sensing when that thing is around." I sank into a chair, still trembling. Cooper busied himself making coffee while I tried to collect my thoughts. When he returned with 2 steaming mugs, I finally found my voice again. What was that thing?" I asked hoarsely. Cooper sighed heavily. "Honestly, I don't know. Nobody does. It's been spotted in these parts for decades, maybe even centuries. The local tribes have stories about it going back generations. Some kind of ancient spirit or demon, they say." He took a sip of his coffee before continuing. "It seems to feed on fear. It stalks people, terrorizes them. There have been a lot of unexplained disappearances in these mountains over the years. I think that thing is responsible for most of them." I shuddered, remembering the overwhelming sense of malevolence I felt from the creature. "Why haven't the authorities done something about it?" I asked. Cooper laughed bitterly. "You think they'd believe us? A giant, semi-invisible monster prowling the woods? We'd be laughed out of town. A few of us who've encountered it try to watch out for hikers and campers, warn them when we can. But there's only so much we can do." We sat in silence for a while, sipping our coffee. I was starting to calm down a bit, but I knew I'd never be able to forget what I saw out there. "So what happens now?" I asked finally. "Well, you're welcome to stay here until morning," Cooper replied. "I've got a cot in the back room you can use. Once the sun's up, that thing usually retreats deep into the forest. I can give you a ride to the nearest town then if you'd like." I nodded gratefully. "Thank you for everything. You saved my life out there." Cooper waved it off. "Don't mention it. I'm just glad I got there in time. Too many others haven't been so lucky. Just then, Sarge's ears perked up and he let out a low growl. Cooper tensed immediately. "It's back," he whispered. We both turned to look out the window. At first I didn't see anything in the darkness beyond the lights of the gas station. But then I caught a glimpse of movement, a massive shimmering form sliding between the trees at the edge of the forest. I felt that crushing sense of dread wash over me again. Even from this distance I could feel the creature's malevolent gaze fixed on me. It knew I had escaped, and it wasn't happy about it. We watched in tense silence as it paced back and forth just beyond the reach of the lights. After what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, it let out one final bone-chilling shriek before melting back into the darkness of the forest. I let out a shaky breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Cooper put a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Try to get some rest," he said softly. "You're safe in here. Sarge and I will keep watch." I nodded numbly and let him lead me to the back room. As I lay down on the cot, I knew sleep would be a long time coming. The image of that creature was seared into my mind. Even now, months later, I still have nightmares about that night. I've never gone camping or hiking since then. I can't even bring myself to go for walks in the woods near my house anymore. I don't know what that thing was or why it targeted me. But I do know that I'll never forget the terror of being hunted by something so ancient and evil. If you're ever hiking in those mountains, be careful. And if you hear strange noises in the night, don't investigate. Run. Run as fast as you can and don't look back. You might just be its next victim. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural. Growing up, I always thought ghost stories were just that, stories. But after what happened to me last summer, I'm not so sure anymore. It all started when my Uncle James invited me on a hiking trip along the Appalachian Trail. James had been a park ranger in Kentucky for over 20 years, and I jumped at the chance to spend some time with him and explore the great outdoors. We set out early on a warm June morning, driving several hours to reach our starting point on the trail. As we hiked that first day, James regaled me with stories from his years as a ranger. Most were pretty mundane, encounters with wildlife, rescuing lost hikers, that sort of thing. But as the day wore on and the shadows lengthened, his tales took a darker turn. "You know, Riker," he said as we set up camp that evening, "there are things out in these woods that can't be explained, things I've seen and heard that defy logic." I laughed it off at first, assuming he was just trying to spook me, but the look in his eyes was dead serious. "I'm not joking around," he continued. "There are rules you need to follow out here if you want to stay safe, supernatural rules." Now he really had my attention. "What kind of rules?" I asked. James went on to share a list he'd compiled over the years, based on his own experiences and stories from other rangers. Some seemed silly: never sleep with the curtains open, be wary of pets acting strangely. Others were more ominous: don't follow voices in the woods, even if they sound familiar. Avoid unmarked trails. If you hear a siren, run in the opposite direction. I tried to keep an open mind, but it all sounded pretty far-fetched. Still, I couldn't shake the chill that ran down my spine as night fell and the forest grew dark around us. That first night passed uneventfully, but on the second day of our hike, things took a turn for the weird. We'd been walking for hours when we came across an old cabin just off the trail. It looked long abandoned, windows boarded up and roof partially caved in. "Let's check it out," I suggested, always up for exploring. But James grabbed my arm, holding me back. "No," he said firmly, "that's not a good idea. Before I could argue, a dog came bounding out of the woods, a big black lab. It ran right up to the cabin door and started scratching and whining like it was trying to get inside. "That's odd," I said. "Wonder if it belongs to someone nearby." James was already backing away, pulling me with him. "We need to go. Now." I was confused, but something in his tone made me listen. As we hurried down the trail, I glanced back. The dog was gone, but I could have sworn I saw a shadowy figure in one of the cabin windows, watching us leave. That night, huddled around our campfire, James explained. Rule number 8, be wary of animals acting strangely, especially around abandoned buildings. They're not always what they seem. I wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, but I couldn't forget the unease I'd felt, and things only got weirder from there. The next afternoon, we were deep in the woods when we heard it, a loud, wailing siren seeming to come from all around us. There were no roads for miles, no possible source for such a sound, yet it kept getting louder, closer. Without a word, James took off running, and I followed close behind. We sprinted through the forest for what felt like hours, branches whipping at our faces. Finally, the sound faded and we collapsed, gasping for breath. "What? What was that?" I panted. James shook his head grimly. Rule number 3, if you hear a siren in the woods, run and don't look back. I wanted to demand a better explanation, but the haunted look in his eyes stopped me. Whatever it was, he truly believed we'd been in danger. That night was the worst. We'd made camp in a small clearing, and I was drifting off to sleep when a blood-curdling scream jolted me awake. It sounded like a woman in agony, and it was close. I scrambled out of my tent to find James already up, rifle in hand. "Stay close," he warned. We stood back to back, scanning the darkness. The screams continued, sometimes sounding yards away, sometimes right in our ears. Then other noises joined in, childlike laughter, a man calling for help, what sounded like a baby crying. "Don't listen," James kept saying. "It's not real. Don't follow the voices." I was trembling, my heart racing. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of elaborate prank. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The noises built to a crescendo, and then suddenly, silence. The forest was utterly still. We didn't sleep the rest of the night, keeping watch until dawn. As the sun rose, James finally spoke. "I think we had a visit from the Bell Witch," he said quietly. I'd heard of the legendary Tennessee spirit before, but always assumed it was just folklore. Now I wasn't so sure. "She's been known to venture into Kentucky sometimes," James continued. "Likes to torment campers and hikers. We're lucky she didn't do worse." The final strange incident happened on our last day. We were making our way back to the trailhead when I noticed something odd about a trail marker up ahead. It seemed to be moving. I blinked, sure I was seeing things. But no, the wooden post was slowly rotating, all on its own. As we watched in disbelief, it turned a full 180 degrees, now pointing deeper into the woods instead of towards the exit. James cursed under his breath. Rule number 12, never trust a moving trail marker. They're trying to lead you astray. We gave the post a wide berth as we passed, and I could have sworn I heard faint laughter on the breeze. When we finally reached the car, I was both relieved and oddly disappointed. Part of me had grown to love the eerie mystery of the trail, despite the fear. On the drive home, I made a decision. "I think I want to move out here," I told James. "Get a job as a ranger myself." He looked surprised, then pleased. "I was hoping you might say that. This place has a way of getting under your skin." Before dropping me off, he handed me a folded piece of paper. My list of rules, he explained. Memorize them, add to them. They might just save your life one day. I nodded solemnly, tucking the paper away. As I watched him drive off, I felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. My life was about to change in ways I couldn't imagine. The Appalachian Trail had called to me, and I was answering. That was 6 months ago. I'm a trainee ranger now, learning the ropes from James and the others. I've had a few more strange encounters, nothing I can fully explain, but I'm starting to understand why my uncle loves this job so much. There's magic in these woods, dark and light, beautiful and terrifying. I keep James's list of rules with me always, and I've already added a few of my own. Rule number 23. If you see your own reflection blink, run. Rule number 24. Never eat berries that grow in a perfect circle. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, sure I've heard that siren again. But I'm not scared anymore. This is my home now, and I'm learning its secrets, one supernatural encounter at a time. My name's James, and I've been a forest ranger for about 5 years now. It's usually a pretty quiet job, lots of hiking, wildlife observation, and helping lost tourists. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened last spring. Dan Williams was one of our newer rangers, only on the job for about 8 months. Nice guy, early 30s, always eager to learn. We'd grab beers after work sometimes and swap stories. He was settling into the job well and seemed to love being out in nature. That's why it was so weird when Dan didn't show up for his shift one Monday morning. He was always punctual, so right away I had a bad feeling. I tried calling his cell, but it went straight to voicemail. After a couple hours with no word, my supervisor asked me to swing by Dan's cabin to check on him. Dan lived in one of the small ranger cabins about 20 minutes from the main station. As I drove out there, I kept trying to convince myself he'd just overslept or his alarm didn't go off. But there was a gnawing dread in the pit of my stomach that I couldn't shake. I pulled up to Dan's cabin around 11 a.m. His truck was still in the driveway, which struck me as odd. If he'd had car trouble, he would have called in. I knocked on the front door. No answer. I tried the handle and found it unlocked, which was another red flag. We always kept our doors locked out here in the woods. "Dan?" I called out as I stepped inside. The cabin was dead silent. A half-empty coffee mug sat on the kitchen counter, like he'd been in the middle of his morning routine. But there was no sign of Dan. I made my way down the short hallway to his bedroom, my heart pounding. The door was closed. I took a deep breath and turned the handle. What I saw when I opened that door is seared into my brain forever. Dan was lying in bed, eyes wide open and fixed on the ceiling. But it wasn't peaceful like he was sleeping. His face was contorted in a look of absolute terror. His mouth was frozen in a silent scream, jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles straining in his neck. I rushed to the bedside calling his name, but I knew it was too late. His skin was cold and pale. He'd been dead for hours. I stumbled back, trying to process what I was seeing. That's when I noticed something else strange. All the curtains in the room were drawn tight, blocking out any sunlight. Dan always liked to sleep with the windows open to hear the sounds of the forest. Why would he have closed everything up? With shaking hands, I called my supervisor and then 911. The next few hours were a blur of police, paramedics, and investigators combing through the cabin. I must have retold what I'd found a dozen times. As they wheeled Dan's body out on a gurney, my supervisor pulled me aside. He had a grim look on his face as he asked me, "James, this is important. Were the curtains in Dan's bedroom open or closed when you found him? I was thrown off by the oddly specific question. Closed, I replied. All of them were shut tight. Why? He just shook his head and muttered, "Damn, I was afraid of that." Before I could ask what he meant, he walked away to talk to the police chief. The coroner's report came back inconclusive. No signs of injury, no evidence of a heart attack or stroke. They called it sudden unexplained death syndrome, but that felt like a cop-out. How does a healthy 30-year-old just die of fright in his sleep? In the weeks that followed, I couldn't stop replaying that morning in my head. The look of terror on Dan's face, the closed curtains, my supervisor's cryptic question. It all felt connected somehow, but I couldn't figure out how. I started asking around, seeing if Dan had mentioned anything strange in the days before his death. Most people said he seemed normal, but his neighbor Carol told me something that made my blood run cold. "You know, the night before he died, I was out walking my dog late," Carol said. "As I passed Dan's cabin, I could have sworn I saw someone standing at his bedroom window staring out. But it was dark, and when I looked again, there was nothing there. I figured my eyes were playing tricks on me." A chill ran down my spine. I thanked Carol and left, my mind racing. What the hell had Dan seen that night? What could terrify a man so badly it stopped his heart? I threw myself into research, digging through old ranger logs and local folklore. That's when I stumbled on something that made everything click. A series of similar deaths in these woods stretching back decades. Always the same pattern. A person found dead in bed, face frozen in terror, curtains drawn tight. The locals had whispered stories about it for years. They called it the Night Watcher, a dark entity that appeared at bedroom windows in the dead of night. If you saw it, you'd be found dead by morning, literally scared to death. I know how insane this sounds. I'm not normally one for ghost stories or supernatural stuff. But after what I saw, what else could explain it? The closed curtains, Dan's terrified expression, the long history of similar deaths. It all fit. I've been sleeping with my curtains open ever since, too afraid of what I might see if I closed them. Every night I lie awake, watching the shadows outside my window, wondering if tonight will be the night the Night Watcher comes for me. I don't know why Dan was targeted, or if I'm next for uncovering this. All I know is that something evil is out there in those woods. And if you're ever in this area, whatever you do, don't look out your window after dark. You never know what might be looking back. It all started on what should have been a peaceful Sunday hike with my husband, Tom. We'd been going through a rough patch after losing our son Brandon in a car accident the year before. The grief had taken its toll on our marriage, but we were slowly finding our way back to each other. This hike was supposed to be a chance for us to reconnect and enjoy nature together. We set out early that morning on a familiar trail in the mountains near our home. The air was crisp and cool, and the forest was alive with birdsong. For the first time in ages, I felt a glimmer of hope that things might actually be okay. About an hour into our hike, we stopped to rest on some rocks overlooking a steep ravine. Tom seemed distracted and kept looking around, cocking his head like he was listening for something. "Do you hear that?" he asked suddenly. I paused, straining my ears. "Hear what?" "That voice," he said. It sounds like Brandon." My blood ran cold. "Tom, that's not possible. Brandon's gone." But he wasn't listening. His eyes had a faraway look, and he stood up abruptly. "It's coming from over there," he said, pointing off the trail into the dense underbrush. I grabbed his arm. Tom, stop. There's nothing there. You're imagining things. He shook me off. No, I can hear him. He's calling for me. And before I could stop him, he plunged off the trail into the woods. Tom, wait, I called after him, but he was already disappearing into the trees. Panic rising in my chest, I scrambled after him. The underbrush was thick, branches whipping at my face and arms as I pushed through. I could hear Tom crashing ahead of me, calling out Brandon's name. Tom, please, I yelled. Come back, you're scaring me. But he didn't slow down. If anything, he seemed to be moving faster, driven by some unseen force. I was struggling to keep up, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. Suddenly, the ground dropped away beneath my feet. I barely caught myself on a tree trunk, heart pounding as I realized how close I'd come to tumbling down a steep slope. Tom, I screamed, stop, there's a cliff. For a moment, everything went quiet. Then I heard Tom's voice, sounding confused and far away. Jenny, where are you? Stay where you are, I called back. I'm coming to get you. Carefully, I inched my way along the edge of the ravine, using trees and rocks for support. I could see Tom now, about 50 feet ahead of me. He was standing at the very edge of a sheer drop, swaying slightly. Tom, I said as calmly as I could, step back from the edge, please. He turned to look at me, and my heart nearly stopped. His eyes were glazed over, unfocused. It was like he was in a trance. I can see him, Tom said dreamily. He's right there, Jenny, our boy. No, Tom, I pleaded. There's nothing there. It's just rocks and trees. Please come back to me. He shook his head. You don't understand. He needs me. I have to go to him. Tom, no. But it was too late. As if in slow motion, I saw Tom take a step forward, right off the edge of the cliff. There was a moment where he seemed to hang in the air, and then he was gone. I don't remember much of what happened next. I know I screamed until my throat was raw. I remember fumbling for my phone with shaking hands, calling 911. The rest is a blur of park rangers, search and rescue teams, and finally, the terrible moment when they found Tom's body at the bottom of the ravine. The official report said it was an accidental fall, but I know what I saw that day. Tom wasn't himself. It was like something had taken control of him, luring him to his death with the voice of our dead son. In the months since, I've replayed that day in my mind 1,000 times. Could I have done something differently? Should I have seen the signs earlier? The guilt is crushing. But there's something else, too. A nagging feeling that won't go away. Because sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I swear I can hear Brandon's voice calling out. And for a split second, I understand the pull Tom must have felt. I haven't told anyone else about this. They'd think I was crazy, grief-stricken and imagining things. But I know what I heard. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever took Tom that day isn't finished with our family. I'm writing this as a warning. If you're out in the woods and you hear a voice calling to you, a voice that shouldn't be there, don't listen, don't follow, because you might not make it back. I don't know if I'll ever understand what really happened that day. All I know is that I lost my son, and then I lost my husband to something I can't explain. And now, every time I close my eyes, I see Tom standing at the edge of that cliff, about to step into oblivion. I'm scared, not just of what happened, but of what might still be out there. Because if it could happen to Tom, who's to say it couldn't happen to anyone? To me? I haven't been back to those trails since that day. I can't bring myself to face that place again. But sometimes I catch myself staring out the window at the mountains in the distance, wondering if somewhere in those woods the voice is still calling. If you've experienced anything like this, please reach out. I need to know I'm not alone in this. And if you haven't, well, consider yourself lucky. And whatever you do, be careful out there, because you never know what might be waiting in the shadows, calling your name. The day started out normal enough. I packed up my gear, loaded Rex into the car, and we set off for a remote campsite about 3 hours from the city. I was excited for some peace and quiet, just me and my faithful companion surrounded by nature. If only I'd known what was lurking out there. We arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon. It was beautiful. A small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a babbling creek nearby. I set up my tent and got a fire going as the sun started to set. Rex seemed on edge, pacing around and whining occasionally, but I chalked it up to him being in a new environment. As darkness fell, I roasted some hot dogs over the fire and tossed Rex a few bites. The night was so still and quiet, almost eerily so. No chirping crickets or hooting owls, just the soft crackling of the fire. I had this growing sense of unease, like we were being watched, but I tried to shake it off. I'm not usually the paranoid type. I remembered the old timer at the general store where I'd stopped for supplies. He'd warned me not to whistle at night in these woods. Said it could call things you don't want to meet. I'd laughed it off at the time. Just some local superstition, right? But sitting there in the dark, those words kept echoing in my head. Maybe it was the beer I'd had, or just my own stubbornness, but I decided to test it out. I let out a sharp whistle, piercing the silence of the night. Rex's ears immediately perked up and he started growling low in his throat. I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear any response. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then I heard it, a faint whistle in return, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. My blood ran cold. It had to be an echo or another camper, I told myself. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I quickly doused the fire and retreated to my tent, zipping it up tight with Rex inside. He was on high alert now, hackles raised, a constant low growl rumbling in his chest. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, that there was a logical explanation. But every snapping twig or rustle of leaves outside sent my heart racing. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, Rex was barking furiously and scratching at the tent door. I jolted awake, fumbling for my flashlight with shaking hands. The world outside the tent was pitch black, the kind of darkness that seems to swallow up any light. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. At first I saw nothing but inky blackness. Then my flashlight beam caught something that made my breath catch in my throat. Standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind a massive pine, was something. It was tall, impossibly tall. At least 8 or 9 feet. Its limbs were long and distorted, bent at unnatural angles. But it was the face that haunts me to this day. Pale, almost glowing in the darkness, with huge black eyes that seemed to bore right through me. Its mouth was stretched in a grotesque parody of a smile, filled with jagged teeth. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in terror. The creature tilted its head, studying me with those soulless eyes. Then it took a step forward, emerging fully from behind the tree. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. That's when Rex burst out of the tent, snarling and barking with a ferocity I'd never seen from him before. He planted himself between me and the creature, fur standing on end. The thing paused, seeming unsure how to react to this new development. For a moment, everything was still. Then the creature opened its mouth and let out a sound that will haunt my nightmares forever. It wasn't a roar or a screech. It was almost like laughter, but distorted and wrong, echoing through the trees and sending ice down my spine. Rex lunged forward, snapping and snarling. The creature stumbled back, clearly not expecting such fierce resistance. It let out another of those horrible laughing sounds, this time tinged with what almost seemed like frustration. I don't know where I found the courage, but I managed to grab my backpack and Rex's leash. With my dog still holding the creature at bay, I started backing away, my eyes never leaving that horrifying face. We made it to my car, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. As we peeled out of there, tires kicking up dirt and gravel, I caught one last glimpse of the creature in my rearview mirror. It was just standing there, watching us go, that wide, tooth-filled grin still plastered across its face. I drove for hours, not stopping until the sun was well above the horizon. I kept expecting to see that thing in my rearview mirror chasing us down the highway. But there was nothing, just empty road behind us. It's been months now, and I still have nightmares about that night. I've tried researching, looking for any similar encounters or local legends that might explain what I saw. But I've come up empty. Part of me wants to go back, to prove to myself that it wasn't real. But a bigger part knows that some things are better left alone. I don't camp anymore. Hell, I can barely bring myself to walk Rex after dark. That whistle in the night opened a door to something that should have stayed hidden. And I live with the constant fear that someday, somehow, that door might open again. So if you're ever out in those woods and the silence of the night tempts you to break it, don't. Some calls are better left unanswered, and some things should stay in the darkness where they belong. It was supposed to be a routine patrol of a remote area of the national forest. I'd hiked those trails hundreds of times before, but somehow I lost my bearings. The trees all started to look the same, and my GPS wasn't working right. Before I knew it, I was completely turned around. As the sun started to set, panic set in. I was miles from any roads or campsites, with no cell signal. The temperature was dropping fast. Just as I was considering hunkering down for the night, I saw a faint light through the trees. I approached cautiously and found a small log cabin. It looked old, but well maintained. Smoke was coming from the chimney. I hesitated, but I was desperate for help. I knocked on the door. An elderly woman answered. She had long silver hair and piercing blue eyes. Something about her gaze made me uneasy, but she smiled warmly and invited me in. The inside of the cabin was cozy, filled with strange antiques and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. The woman introduced herself as Agnes and offered me a cup of tea. I gratefully accepted, explaining my predicament. As we talked, I started to feel odd. The room seemed to shimmer and warp around me. Agnes's voice became distorted. I remember her saying something about opening your mind's eye before everything went black. The next thing I knew, I was lying face down in the forest. It was dawn. My clothes were damp with dew, and I was freezing. I stumbled to my feet, disoriented and nauseous. Incredibly, I recognized where I was, less than a mile from my truck, but that was impossible. I'd been miles away when I found the cabin. And where was the cabin? I looked around frantically, but there was no sign of it. I made it back to my vehicle and drove straight to the ranger station. My colleagues were shocked. Apparently I'd been missing for 3 days. I tried to explain what happened, but it all sounded insane. They assumed I'd gotten lost and was suffering from exposure and dehydration. I took a few days off to recover, but I couldn't stop thinking about Agnes and her cabin. I became obsessed with finding it again. I pored over maps, trying to retrace my steps. I went back into the woods every chance I got, searching. My coworkers started to worry. They said I wasn't acting like myself. I grew paranoid, convinced they were hiding something from me. I neglected my duties, spending all my time in the forest. One day, while hiking way off trail, I came across an old man with a gnarled wooden staff. He looked ancient, with a long white beard. When I asked if he'd seen a cabin, he just laughed and said, "Oh, you've seen her, have you? Best forget about that, son. Some doors aren't meant to be opened twice." Before I could question him further, he disappeared into the trees. I tried to follow, but it was like he'd vanished into thin air. That encounter only fueled my obsession. I started having vivid nightmares about the cabin. In my dreams, I'd open the door and see impossible things on the other side. Vast alien landscapes, creatures from the depths of the ocean, glimpses of other worlds. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. My behavior at work became erratic. I'd zone out for hours, staring at nothing. I'd mutter to myself about secret paths in the woods. Eventually, my supervisor sat me down for a talk. He said I needed to take an extended leave of absence and get some help. I refused. I quit on the spot and headed straight for the forest. I was convinced that if I could just find Agnes again, everything would make sense. I hiked for days, barely sleeping or eating. On the 5th day, delirious from exhaustion, I stumbled into a clearing. There was a group of people living there in makeshift shelters. They seemed wary of me at first, but when I mentioned Agnes and the cabin, their demeanor changed. An older woman approached me. "We've been waiting for you," she said. "Agnes told us you might come." My heart leapt. Finally, proof I wasn't crazy. But as the woman continued talking, my hope turned to dread. She spoke of cosmic gateways and ancient forest spirits, of rituals to ascend to higher planes of existence. It all sounded like the ravings of a cult. I backed away slowly, but they surrounded me. "You've been chosen," they kept saying. "Agnes has marked you. You must complete the journey." In that moment, survival instinct kicked in. I bolted, crashing through the underbrush. I ran for what felt like hours, branches whipping my face. Eventually, I broke through the tree line and found myself on a rural highway. A passing motorist picked me up and took me to the nearest town. I was a mess, dehydrated, covered in cuts and bruises, babbling incoherently about magic cabins and forest cults. The next few days are a blur. I vaguely remember being in a hospital, then transferred to a psychiatric facility. They diagnosed me with delusional disorder and put me on heavy medication. It's been months now. The doctors say I'm making progress, but I'm not so sure. Sometimes I think I really did hallucinate the whole thing. Other times, I'm convinced it was all real, that there are secrets in those woods that most people couldn't handle knowing. Late at night, when the meds wear off, I can still hear Agnes's voice. "Some doors aren't meant to be opened twice," she whispers. And I wonder, what exactly did I see on the other side of that door? What did it do to me? I don't know if I'll ever have answers. All I know is that I can't go back to who I was before. That forest changed me, whether it was all in my head or not. Sometimes I catch myself staring out the window of the treatment center, towards the distant trees, and for a split second, I swear I can see a faint light glowing between the branches, beckoning me back into the depths of the unknown. It was a crisp autumn morning when I set out on a new trail I'd been wanting to check out. The leaves were just starting to change colors, creating a beautiful canopy of reds, oranges, and golds overhead. I packed my usual gear, water, snacks, first aid kit, and headed into the woods, feeling excited for a day of solitude and nature. The first few hours were peaceful and uneventful. I took my time, stopping occasionally to admire particularly scenic views or interesting plants and fungi along the path. But as the day wore on, I started to get an uneasy feeling. The trail seemed to be getting less and less defined, and I realized I hadn't seen any trail markers in quite a while. I pulled out my map and compass, trying to get my bearings, but nothing looked familiar. With a sinking feeling in my stomach, I had to admit the truth to myself. I was lost. I tried retracing my steps, but only seemed to get more turned around. The trees all looked the same, and I couldn't find any landmarks I recognized. As panic started to set in, I heard what sounded like footsteps crunching through the leaves behind me. I whirled around, both relieved and startled to see an older woman standing there. She looked to be in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a bun and wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose. "Are you lost, dear?" she asked in a kind voice. I nodded, embarrassed. "I'm afraid so. I can't seem to find my way back to the main trail." She smiled gently. "Not to worry. I know these woods like the back of my hand. I'd be happy to help you find your way." I felt immense relief wash over me. "Thank you so much. I really appreciate it." As we started walking, I introduced myself and asked her name. "Oh, you can just call me Agnes," she replied. "I've been hiking these trails for decades." We chatted as we walked, and I found Agnes to be a wealth of knowledge about the local flora and fauna. She pointed out interesting plants and told me about the history of the area. Despite my initial fear, I found myself enjoying her company and the walk. After about an hour, Agnes paused. "We're getting close to the main trail now. It should be just up ahead." Sure enough, I soon spotted a familiar trail marker. Overwhelmed with gratitude, I turned to thank Agnes profusely, but she was gone. I blinked in confusion, looking all around. There was no sign of her anywhere. "Agnes," I called out. Only silence answered me. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered an old local legend I'd heard about the lady in silver glasses, a ghostly figure said to help lost hikers find their way. I'd always dismissed it as a silly campfire story, but now I hurried back to my car, my mind reeling. Had I really just spent hours walking with a ghost? It seemed impossible, and yet I couldn't explain what had happened. Agnes had seemed so real, so physical. We'd talked for hours. How could she have vanished into thin air? In the days since, I've scoured local records and hiking forums, trying to find any information about an Agnes matching her description. But I've found nothing concrete. Just more whispered stories and legends about the mysterious woman in silver glasses who appears to lost hikers. I don't know what to believe anymore. All I know is that something inexplicable happened to me in those woods. Was Agnes a kind stranger who slipped away while I wasn't looking? A figment of my panicked imagination? Or something more supernatural? I find myself both eager to return to those trails, hoping for another glimpse of her, and terrified of what I might find. Every time I see an older woman with silver hair, my heart skips a beat. I've started wearing my own pair of silver-framed glasses, almost like a good luck charm. They say if you help the lady in silver glasses, you'll have 7 years of good fortune. I'm not sure I believe that, but I do know that whatever, or whoever, Agnes was, she helped me when I desperately needed it. And for that, I'll always be grateful. I still hike regularly, but now I'm much more careful about staying on marked trails. and I always carry an extra pair of glasses in my pack, just in case, because you never know who you might meet out there in the woods, or what strange encounters await. The forest holds many secrets, and I feel like I've only scratched the surface of its mysteries. Sometimes at night, I dream of Agnes. In my dreams, we're walking through sun-dappled woods, talking and laughing. But when I turn to look at her, all I see is mist and shadow. I wake up with a mixture of peace and unease, the echo of her gentle voice fading in my ears. I've thought about reporting my experience to the park rangers or local authorities, but what would I even say? I got lost and was rescued by a possibly spectral old lady? I'd sound insane. So I've kept it to myself, turning it over and over in my mind, searching for some rational explanation. Part of me hopes that someday I'll run into Agnes again, the real flesh and blood Agnes, and we can laugh about the misunderstanding. But deep down, I know that's unlikely. Whatever happened that day in the woods was something beyond ordinary explanation. I've started researching other encounters with the lady in silver glasses. Most are vague second-hand accounts, but a few are eerily similar to mine. Always an older woman, always silver glasses, always helping lost hikers before vanishing. It's both comforting and unsettling to know I'm not alone in my experience. I've become somewhat obsessed, I'll admit. I've joined online forums dedicated to local legends and paranormal encounters. I've interviewed other hikers and campers, hoping to gather more information. But concrete answers remain elusive. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the stress and fear of being lost caused me to hallucinate or misremember. But then I'll catch a whiff of pine needles or hear leaves crunching underfoot, and I'm instantly transported back to that day. The memory is so vivid, so real. I can still picture every detail of Agnes's face, still hear the cadence of her voice. I've started carrying a small notebook with me on hikes, jotting down any unusual sights or experiences. So far, nothing out of the ordinary has happened. But I can't shake the feeling that the forests hold more secrets than we realize, that there are things out there beyond our understanding. My friends and family have noticed the change in me. They say I seem distracted, preoccupied. When I try to explain what happened, they exchange worried glances. I know they think I'm losing it. Maybe I am, but I can't let it go. I need to know the truth. I've started volunteering with the Park Service, helping maintain trails and assist other hikers. Part of it is genuinely wanting to give back to the community. But if I'm honest, there's also a hope that I might encounter Agnes again, or at least gather more information about her. As the months have passed, my obsession has faded somewhat. I still think about Agnes often, still wonder about what really happened that day. But I've come to accept that I may never have all the answers. And maybe that's okay. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Perhaps the not knowing is what makes them special. All I know for certain is that something extraordinary happened to me in those woods. Whether it was a ghostly encounter, a brush with local legend, or simply the kindness of a stranger, it changed me. I still hike whenever I can, still love the peace and beauty of the forest, but now I approach it with a sense of wonder and possibility I never had before. Every rustle of leaves, every distant footstep holds the potential for magic, and sometimes, when the light filters just right through the trees, I could swear I catch a glimpse of silver out of the corner of my eye, a glint of glasses, a flash of hair. But when I turn to look, there's nothing there but shadows and leaves. Whatever the truth may be, I'll always be grateful for the day I met Agnes. She didn't just help me find my way out of the woods. She opened my eyes to a world of mystery and wonder I never knew existed. And for that, I'll keep searching, keep exploring, keep believing in the impossible, because you never know what or who you might find out there in the wild. The first day was great. We hiked, set up camp, and spent the evening around the fire, drinking beers and telling stupid jokes. As night fell, the forest seemed to close in around us. The darkness between the trees was almost solid, but we felt safe in the glow of our campfire. Around midnight, we were about to turn in when we heard footsteps approaching. Out of the darkness emerged this old man. He must have been at least 80, with a long white beard and gnarled hands gripping a wooden walking stick. None of us said a word as he shuffled into the firelight. Without introduction, he sat down on a log and began to speak. His voice was low and gravelly, but it carried easily in the still night air. "Let me tell you a story," he said, "about these very woods." I glanced at my friends. They looked as confused as I felt. Who was this guy? Where did he come from? But something made us stay silent and listen. He told a tale of early settlers in the area, of harsh winters and mysterious disappearances. His words painted vivid pictures in my mind. I could almost see the snow-laden trees and hear the howling wind he described. As he spoke, I felt a growing unease. It wasn't just the creepy story. There was something off about the old man himself. His eyes never seemed to blink. The firelight cast strange shadows across his face, making it look like his features were shifting. I wanted to ask who he was, where he came from. The words were on the tip of my tongue. But then I remembered something I'd heard years ago, a local legend about these woods. It was said that sometimes an old storyteller would visit campers at night, and you weren't supposed to interrupt him or ask questions. If you did, just as I was about to open my mouth, Chris elbowed me sharply. When I looked at him, he shook his head slightly. He must have been thinking the same thing. So we sat and listened as the old man's story grew darker. He spoke of ancient evils lurking in the forest, of hikers who strayed from the path and were never seen again. His voice took on a hypnotic quality. I found myself leaning forward, hanging on every word. I'm not sure how long he talked. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning. But eventually, his story came to an end. He fell silent, staring into the dying embers of our fire. For a long moment, nobody moved or spoke. Then, without a word, the old man stood up and walked back into the darkness. We watched him go, still too stunned to speak. It was Mike who finally broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. We stayed up the rest of the night, huddled close to the fire. None of us wanted to sleep after that. As the sky began to lighten, we decided to pack up and leave. The forest that had seemed so inviting yesterday now felt oppressive and threatening. It wasn't until we were driving home that Emma told us what she'd seen. While the old man was telling his story, she'd glanced behind him into the woods. She swore she saw shapes moving in the darkness, shadowy figures that seemed to be listening too. We tried to rationalize it, of course. He was probably just some local eccentric who liked scaring campers. The shapes in the woods were likely animals or just tricks of the light. But deep down, I knew better. I've done some research since then, trying to find out more about the legend of the old storyteller. What I've found has only deepened the mystery. There are accounts going back decades of similar encounters. Always an old man with a beard and a walking stick, always appearing at night to tell his stories. But here's the really creepy part. In many of these accounts, someone in the group interrupted the storyteller or tried to leave before he finished. And in every single case, One of their friends disappeared during the night, never to be seen again. I can't help but think about what might have happened if I'd asked the old man who he was, or if we'd gone to bed before his story was done. Would one of us have vanished into those dark woods? I still have nightmares about that night. In them, I'm back in those woods, listening to the old man's stories. But this time, I interrupt him, and then I turn around to find all my friends gone, leaving me alone in the darkness with something else. We've never gone camping since that trip. None of us can bear the thought of being in the woods at night, and whenever I see an old man with a beard, my blood runs cold. I don't know who or what that storyteller really was. Part of me doesn't want to know, but I do know this. If you're ever camping in the woods and an old man appears to tell you a story, listen quietly and don't leave until he's done. Your life may depend on it. On our third day out, we veered pretty far from the main trails. We were deep in some dense forest, surrounded by towering pines and hardly any sunlight filtering through. As we hiked, I started to get this weird feeling in the pit of my stomach. You know that sensation when you feel like you're being watched? It was like that, but way more intense. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was never anything there. Jake must have sensed my unease because he suggested we take a break. We found a small clearing and sat down to rest and have a snack. That's when we first noticed the smell. It was like wood smoke mixed with something off. Something not quite right that I couldn't put my finger on. We both looked at each other, confused. "You smell that?" Jake asked. I nodded, already scanning our surroundings. That's when we saw it through a gap in the trees, wisps of smoke rising up. Curious, we decided to investigate. As we got closer, the smoke got thicker, and we could hear the crackling of a fire. But there were no voices, no sounds of people moving around, just that fire. We pushed through some thick underbrush and suddenly found ourselves on the edge of a small clearing. What we saw there made my blood run cold. It was a campsite, but like nothing I'd ever seen before. There were several crude lean-tos made of branches and pine boughs. A large fire pit in the center still had flames flickering, with what looked like some kind of stew bubbling in a pot over it. Strung between trees were ropes with clothes and pelts hanging to dry. There were piles of firewood, makeshift tools scattered about, even plates of half-eaten food on rough-hewn log benches. But there wasn't a single person in sight. Jake and I just stood there, frozen. It was like we'd stumbled onto some kind of ghost camp. Everything looked like it was in use, like the occupants had just stepped away for a moment. But there was an eerie stillness that told me no one had been there for a while. "What the hell?" Jake whispered. I could only shake my head, totally baffled. We cautiously stepped further into the clearing, looking around in disbelief. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were no footprints, anywhere. The forest floor was soft and damp, our own boots leaving clear impressions. But around the campsite, nothing. It was like the people who made this place had never touched the ground. As we moved closer to inspect things, the air seemed to get heavier. That weird smell from earlier was stronger here. Wood smoke mixed with something metallic and rotten. I felt dizzy, like the air itself was pressing down on me. Jake reached out to touch one of the pelts hanging nearby. Just as his fingers were about to make contact, a gust of icy wind whipped through the clearing. The fire flared up unnaturally high for a split second, and I swear I heard something, like whispers on the wind, but in a language I didn't understand. We both jumped back, hearts racing. "We need to go, now," I said, grabbing Jake's arm. He nodded, face pale. As we turned to leave, movement caught my eye. One of the lean-tos seemed to ripple, like heat waves rising off hot pavement. But it was cool in the shade of the trees. Before I could process what I was seeing, Jake yanked on my arm. "Run!" he yelled. We took off, sprinting back the way we came. As we ran, crashing through the underbrush, that oppressive feeling grew stronger. The whispers got louder, seeming to come from all around us. Out of the corner of my eye, I kept seeing flashes of movement, shadows darting between trees. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. We ran until our lungs were burning, finally collapsing in exhaustion once we felt we'd put enough distance between us and that place. As we sat there gasping for air, the forest around us seemed normal again. The oppressive feeling was gone, replaced by the usual peaceful sounds of birds and wind in the trees. Jake and I looked at each other, both trying to process what we'd just experienced. What was that place?" he finally managed to say between breaths. I shook my head. "I have no idea, but I've never felt anything like that before. It was like the whole clearing was alive somehow, watching us." We debated going back to try and document what we'd seen, maybe take some pictures. But deep down, we both knew we couldn't. The very thought of returning there filled me with a primal dread I can't even describe. We cut our trip short after that, heading back to civilization the next day. Neither of us felt comfortable staying out there any longer. The rest of the hike, we kept seeing things out of the corners of our eyes, hearing whispers just on the edge of hearing. It wasn't until we were back in the car heading home that we finally started to relax. I've tried researching since then, looking for any similar reports or local legends that might explain what we saw. But I found nothing concrete, just vague stories of hikers going missing in that general area over the years. Sometimes I wonder if we imagined the whole thing, if maybe we ate some bad trail mix and hallucinated it all. But then I'll catch a whiff of wood smoke or see a shadow move in a way it shouldn't, and that feeling of dread comes rushing back. I don't know what that place was. Some kind of portal to another dimension? The home of forest spirits or fey creatures? Or something even stranger that we can't comprehend? All I know is that it was real, and it was terrifying. And I can't shake the feeling that we only got away because whatever lived there let us go. I'm writing this partly to warn others who might be thinking of going off trail in that area. If you come across a campsite that looks abandoned but still in use, don't investigate. Don't touch anything. Just turn around and get out of there as fast as you can. Because I'm convinced that if we'd stayed any longer or touched anything in that camp, we never would have made it out of those woods. Even now, weeks later, I still have nightmares about that place. I'll wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of those otherworldly whispers echoing in my ears. The image of that lean-to rippling like it wasn't quite solid is burned into my mind. Jake and I have talked about it a few times since then, trying to make sense of what happened. But we always end up going in circles, unable to come up with any logical explanation. We've agreed to never go back to that part of the forest again. Some things are better left alone. I know this all sounds crazy. If someone had told me this story before it happened, I probably wouldn't have believed them. But I know what I saw, what I felt. That place was real, and whatever inhabits it is beyond our understanding. So if you're planning a hike in the backcountry, stick to the marked trails. Don't go exploring off the beaten path, because you never know what you might find out there in the deep woods. And some discoveries are better left unmade. I still catch myself looking over my shoulder sometimes, half expecting to see shadowy figures moving just out of sight. And on quiet nights, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear those whispers, calling me back to that impossible campsite deep in the forest. But I'll never answer that call. Some mysteries are meant to stay unsolved.